I stood by a marble pillar in the NovaTech lobby, holding my husband's second anniversary gift. Above me, on the glass-railed mezzanine, Julian stood before 200 employees. He wasn't delivering a quarterly report. He was sliding a custom platinum diamond ring onto the finger of his chief operating officer, Victoria. The staff erupted into applause as my husband pulled her in for a kiss. My name is Elena, and I am 32 years old. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. What Julian didn't know as he smiled for the corporate photographer was that I wasn't just his quiet wife. I was the faceless angel investor holding a 62% controlling stake in his empire. I turned around, dropped the velvet anniversary box into a lobby trash bin, and pulled out my phone. I dialed my proxy attorney and whispered exactly 2 sentences: freeze all corporate accounts. Liquidate the $245 million. I walked out through the revolving glass doors into the biting Boston air, leaving him to discover his own financial execution. 112 missed calls later, my doorbell rang. If you have ever watched someone dig their own grave while standing on your shoulders, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And while you are at it, drop a comment with your age, your current city, and your local time. I love seeing exactly where this story finds you. Now, let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday, 3 years ago. The Somerville garage smelled of damp concrete, stale espresso, and the sharp ozone tang of overheating motherboard fans. Julian Vance sat hunched over a folding plastic table. He typed with a frantic, punishing rhythm, his shoulders hitched up to his ears. He was 29 years old, building the alpha version of a software logistics engine he would eventually name NovaTech. I sat in the corner on a plastic milk crate, watching him. I wore a frayed gray cardigan and faded denim jeans, outside in the freezing rain. My vehicle was parked dangerously close to the curb, a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dented passenger door and a muffler that rattled whenever the engine idled. I had purchased it with cash on the day we signed the lease for our cramped apartment. I bought it specifically to lie to him. My grandfather had built a shipping logistics empire in the early 90s, when he passed. The bulk of his estate was locked into a generational, irrevocable blind trust by the time I turned 25. That trust had compounded into a sum that most people only read about in financial magazines. I was the silent managing partner of a private equity portfolio, operating through a series of anonymous corporate proxies. Julian knew absolutely none of this. He believed I was a mid-level financial analyst grinding out 50-hour weeks for a modest salary. I hid my wealth because Julian's ego was as fragile as spun glass. He wore his working-class roots not as a badge of resilience, but as an open, festering wound. He viewed the business world through a rigid hierarchy of suffering, convinced that anyone born with a financial advantage was inherently corrupt. To love him, I had to erase myself. I stripped my vocabulary of corporate acquisition terminology. I hid my bespoke blazers in the back of a rented storage unit. I shrank my entire existence to fit perfectly into his resentful worldview. Once a month, I would tell Julian I was visiting my aunt in Connecticut. Instead, I would take a black town car to the financial district, change into a tailored suit in the back seat, and sit at the head of a mahogany boardroom table. I directed corporate mergers. I acquired struggling supply chain firms. I commanded rooms filled with executives twice my age. Then, I would change back into my generic sweater, take the subway back to Somerville, and ask Julian how his code was compiling. The rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof of the garage. Julian hit the enter key on his mechanical keyboard. A rapid cascade of red error codes reflected in the lenses of his glasses. He slammed his fist against the plastic table. The impact tipped over a mug of cold coffee, sending a brown river across his handwritten legal pads. "It is rigged," he hissed through clenched teeth. I stood up from the milk crate and grabbed a roll of paper towels. I stepped behind his chair, gently dabbing at the soaked paper. "The core logic is brilliant," I murmured quietly. Julian snatched the paper towels from my hand. "Logic does not secure funding, Elena, pedigree does. He scrubbed at the table, smearing the ink. Those trust fund kids walk into Sandhill Road in their designer sneakers and walk out with seed money. Guys like me, we just drown. I stood perfectly still. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an encrypted email confirmation from my broker. Finalizing a $3 million capital injection I had orchestrated that morning for an offshore data firm. I ignored the buzz. I placed a hand on Julian's tense shoulder. Your time will come. I lied smoothly. He shrugged my hand off. I will be the one providing for us. Not some corporate machine. Me. This was the fundamental injustice of our relationship. I was an architect forced to play the role of a docile cheerleader. Julian did not want a partner who could challenge him, analyze his blind spots, or solve his problems. He wanted an audience. He needed someone to witness his daily struggle and validate his self-imposed martyrdom. Later that week, we walked to a cheap diner 2 blocks from the garage. The neon sign buzzed through the thick coastal fog. Julian ordered black coffee and a plate of plain toast. He had been rejected by a minor angel investor that afternoon. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When the waitress dropped the check on the sticky laminate table, the total was exactly $8.50. Julian reached into the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out his wallet. I saw his fingers hesitate over a worn credit card. I knew that card was maxed out. I knew he was carrying tens of thousands of dollars in high-interest debt just to keep the servers running in his garage. I reached into my canvas tote bag. Let me grab this one, I offered softly. Julian's head snapped up. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle twitch beneath his skin. Put your purse away, he ordered coldly. I kept my hand on the zipper of my bag. Julian, it is just... I started, letting the sentence trail off. I said put it away. His voice dropped to a harsh, humiliating whisper. The waitress at the next counter turned her head to look at us. My cheeks burned. I had negotiated buyout clauses worth $50 million without blinking. Yet here I was, shrinking under the fluorescent lights of a diner, scolded over an $8 check by a man whose entire net worth was a negative integer. I swallowed the indignity. I slowly slid my hand back into my lap. Julian swiped his card. The machine beeped, approving the charge by what must have been a margin of pennies. He did not speak to me for the entire walk home. I told myself this was love. I told myself that true partnership required sacrifice, but it was not a sacrifice. It was an erasure. His ego was a ticking time bomb, and the timer was entirely tied to his financial insecurity. He spent his nights obsessing over Silicon Valley tech blogs, reading articles by the blue glow of his dual monitors until 3 a.m. He tracked the funding rounds of his peers with obsessive, venomous envy. He memorized their valuations. He stalked their social media profiles. He was desperate for validation, craving the status of a tech founder far more than he cared about the stability of his actual product. I watched him spiral. I calculated the exact burn rate of his modest savings. According to my silent math, he had exactly 3 weeks of server costs left before NovaTech would be forced to shut down its entire network. The irony was suffocating. I spent my days analyzing market risks and identifying toxic assets. My entire career was built on the premise of spotting fatal corporate flaws before the market did. Yet, in my own home, I was willfully ignoring the largest toxic asset of all my husband's fragile masculinity. I watched him throw away unopened envelopes from collections agencies. I watched him pace the concrete floor of the garage, muttering to himself, convinced that his genius was simply misunderstood by a mediocre world. I wanted to save him. I had the power to write a single check that would clear his debts, fund his beta launch, and secure his patents. But I was trapped by the very monster I had helped nurture. If I revealed my generational wealth, his pride would shatter. He would resent me forever for being the trust fund kid he so viciously despised. If I did nothing, his dream would collapse, and he would drag us both down into his bitter resentment. I sat on the milk crate in the garage day after day, wearing my frayed cardigan, doing the one thing I was trained never to do in the world of private equity. I let a failing asset bleed out. Julian typed furiously into the night, blind to the reality that the woman handing him paper towels was the only entity standing between him and total financial ruin. His need to be the sole provider was not a shield for our relationship. It was a cage. And I was sitting inside it, holding the key in my pocket, waiting for the inevitable crash. The unpaid bills piled up on the kitchen counter like a stack of formal eviction notices. His phone rang constantly with automated calls from debt collectors. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. The alpha launch was rapidly approaching, and the server hosting fees were due on the 1st of the month. He was building a corporate castle on a foundation of maxed-out credit lines and pure, unadulterated arrogance. The collapse was not a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. The crash arrived on a Thursday evening. I walked into our Somerville apartment after a long subway ride and found the living room plunged into darkness. The only light spilled from the open refrigerator door, casting long shadows across the cracked linoleum. Julian sat on the kitchen floor, his knees pulled tight to his chest. A stack of final notice hosting bills lay scattered around his bare feet like fallen leaves. He held his phone loosely in his right hand. The screen displayed a negative bank balance. He had missed his first payroll. His 2 contract developers had just locked him out of the main repository. I set my canvas bag on the counter. "Julian," I whispered softly. He did not look up. A low, guttural sob ripped from his throat. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders heaved under his thin cotton shirt. The sound of his weeping echoed against the cheap laminate cabinets. It was the raw crying of a man watching his entire identity evaporate into nothing. "It is gone," he choked out. His voice was muffled by his palms. I knelt beside him on the cold floor. I reached out to touch his arm. He flinched away from my fingers. He lunged upward, his fist driving hard into the lower cabinet door. The cheap particle board splintered inward. The impact rattled the counter, knocking my ceramic coffee mug into the stainless steel sink. It shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. Julian slid back down the cabinets. He clutched his bruised knuckles against his chest. He stared at the broken ceramic scattered across the metal drain. He did not apologize for the outburst. He just sat there, hollow and defeated, breathing heavily through his nose. I grabbed a small plastic dustpan from under the sink. I knelt beside him again. I swept up the ceramic shards in silence. The scrape of plastic against linoleum masked the sound of his ragged, miserable breathing. The next morning, I waited for him to fall into a heavy, exhausted sleep on our thrifted sofa. I slipped out the front door. I unlocked my rental storage unit down the street, trading my frayed cardigan for a tailored charcoal blazer and a silk blouse. I hailed a black town car to the financial district. Gideon Hayes waited for me in his mahogany-paneled office overlooking the gray waters of the Boston Harbor. Gideon was a senior corporate attorney with a reputation for merciless litigation. He was also the terrifying, faceless principal of my proxy firm, Obsidian Ventures. In reality, he executed my direct orders. He treated me like a daughter, but he never questioned my authority. I sat in the high-backed leather chair across from his sprawling desk. I slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood. "Acquire it," I instructed calmly. Gideon opened the folder. He reviewed the financial summaries for NovaTech. His gray eyebrows pulled together in a tight, disapproving line. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He tapped a gold pen against the ledger. "This asset is bleeding out," Gideon stated flatly. "I am aware," I replied smoothly. Gideon leaned forward, resting his forearms on the leather desk blotter. He looked at me with genuine concern. "Some investments require a total write-off," he warned quietly. I kept my expression neutral. "Execute the transfer today." Gideon sighed. He pressed a silver button on his intercom. He initiated the blind proxy protocol. Within 45 minutes, An intricate web of holding companies moved exactly $245 million. The funds funneled through the Obsidian Ventures accounts directly into NovaTech's corporate registry. I purchased a 62% controlling stake. The legal terms were brutally standard for a distressed asset buyout. I designed the contract to look exactly like a ruthless venture capital play, masking my involvement. I even stipulated a hard exit clause in Section 4, giving Obsidian Ventures the right to liquidate the asset instantly upon executive gross misconduct. I did not realize I was writing my own future divorce settlement. I signed the proxy authorization with a heavy platinum fountain pen. The ink bled into the thick parchment paper. I changed back into my jeans in the lobby restroom. I took the subway back to Somerville, carrying a bag of cheap groceries. 2 days later, the apartment door flew open so hard the brass handle punched a dent into the drywall. Julian burst through the threshold. His face was flushed crimson. He dropped his scuffed leather briefcase, grabbed me by the waist, and lifted me off the floor. He spun me around the narrow hallway, laughing hysterically. "They bought it!" he screamed. He set me down hard. I smoothed my cotton shirt. "Bought what?" "Julian?" I asked perfectly. He paced the living room, running his trembling hands through his unkempt hair. "A faceless genius venture capitalist just saved us Obsidian Ventures. They wired the seed money." He grabbed his heavy laptop, shoving the glowing screen into my face. The corporate banking portal displayed an impossibly long string of zeros. "They saw my code, Elena." He panted breathlessly. His eyes were wild with sudden vindication. "I am so proud of you." I smiled warmly. "I outsmarted the entire market," he yelled aggressively. He pointed a rigid finger at his own chest. He paced the room, his voice escalating into a manic, feverish sermon. He poured 2 glasses of cheap tap water because we had no champagne. Toasting to his own genius, he did not wonder why a private equity firm had bypassed standard due diligence. He did not question the miraculous timing of the deposit. He simply accepted the $245 million as the universe finally recognizing his innate superiority. He credited his own cold emails. He praised his brilliant logic. He was blind to my intervention. I stood in the cramped kitchen, washing dishes with a cheap yellow sponge, listening to my husband passionately praise the ghost of my own proxy. As the weeks passed, his profound relief calcified into something deeply sinister. The money did not humble him. It mutated his deep-seated insecurity into severe, toxic arrogance. The changes started small, creeping into our daily routines. He hired a private cleaning service, telling me he was tired of seeing my sponge resting on the sink edge. Then, the wardrobe changed entirely. The thrift store flannels disappeared overnight. He replaced them with tailored Italian suits and custom silk ties. The Somerville apartment felt suffocating. He littered the countertops with architectural blueprints for an expansive new seaport office space, ignoring the peeling paint on our own ceiling. 3 months after the wire transfer, he walked into the kitchen wearing a heavy gold Rolex. I paused, wiping the counter. I stared at the metallic glint on his wrist. A $60,000 piece of polished metal strapped to the wrist of a man who could not afford to buy me a coffee 3 months prior. "Is that a new watch?" I asked carefully. He unbuttoned his French cuffs, turning his wrist to catch the overhead light. "It is a statement piece," he answered smoothly. "We still have a lease here," I reminded him quietly. Julian scoffed. He snapped the heavy watch clasp shut. The sharp click echoed loudly in the small kitchen. "You have a very small mindset," he sneered coldly. I gripped the damp dishcloth. "I am just being practical." He stepped closer. He looked down at my faded sweater with undisguised contempt. "Stop thinking like a secretary," he commanded harshly. My jaw tightened. I swallowed the sharp, acidic truth, burning in the back of my throat. I was the managing partner holding the financial leash to his entire existence. But I nodded silently, playing the docile role I had constructed for him. He turned his back on me. He walked into the living room, dialing his lead developer. He barked harsh orders into his phone, demanding impossible deadlines with the callous cruelty of a tyrant. He stopped doing the dishes entirely. He stopped asking about my day. He began scheduling late-night dinners with competitive tech founders, leaving me alone in the apartment for hours. When I asked to join him for a corporate dinner, he would look at my clothes, sigh heavily, and tell me I would simply not understand the conversation. I watched the man I loved disappear into a hollow corporate caricature. My heavy capital injection had not saved our marriage, it had funded its destruction. I had taken a desperate, deeply insecure developer and handed him a heavy crown made of $245 million. I created a monster. His fragile ego expanded to fill every single empty space in our lives. He demanded loyalty from his staff. He demanded silent subservience from his wife. He began conducting interviews for executive officers, insisting he needed a ruthless corporate shark to manage his day-to-day operations. He needed someone who spoke his new, arrogant language of excess. He was paving the gold-lined road for Victoria Rollins. 10 months ago, Victoria Rollins crossed the threshold of the Seaport office. Julian hired her as Chief Operating Officer to manage his rapidly scaling workforce. She was 36 years old, armed with an aggressive resume and a vocabulary built out of ruthless corporate buzzwords. She did not just walk into rooms, she occupied them. To celebrate the end of their third quarter, a quarter artificially inflated by the remaining capital from my proxy, Julian hosted a black-tie corporate gala. He rented the Bates Hall Reading Room at the Boston Public Library. Caterers in crisp uniforms carried heavy silver trays of seared scallops and crystal flutes of imported champagne. The cavernous room glowed under the warm, historical light of brass reading lamps and towering, exotic floral arrangements. The scent of roasted lamb mingled with the sharp ozone of wealth. It was a lavish, excessive display of corporate dominance. My corporate dominance. I attended the gala wearing a modest navy blue crepe dress. I had purchased it off the rack at a mid-tier department store the week before. I kept my hair pulled back into a simple, unadorned knot. I wore no jewelry. I was still playing the role of the humble, frugal partner, carefully guarding the secret of my true net worth to protect his delicate pride. I stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching my husband hold court. Julian wore a custom velvet tuxedo. He laughed loudly with angel investors, his chest puffed out, radiating the hollow, intoxicating confidence of a man spending someone else's money. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open. Victoria arrived. She did not wear a traditional evening gown. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored white suit with a plunging neckline. The stark white fabric stood out aggressively against the dark mahogany paneling of the historic library. She glided across the marble floor, her stiletto heels clicking rhythmically, charting a direct, unwavering path toward Julian. I watched from the shadows of a marble bust. Victoria stepped seamlessly into Julian's personal space. She did not offer a professional handshake. She raised her left hand, displaying perfectly manicured nails, and placed her palm flat against the crisp white fabric of his tuxedo shirt. Her fingers rested squarely over his heart. "You outdid yourself tonight," Victoria purred smoothly, tilting her chin up. Julian did not step back. His posture straightened immediately under her lingering touch. "We are just getting started," he answered, his voice dropping a full octave. I gripped the cold stem of my water glass. The intimacy of the physical gesture was not accidental. It was a territorial marker, placed deliberately in the center of a crowded room. She was claiming the chief executive officer. Before I could step forward to intervene, a sharp scent of heavy floral perfume washed over my shoulders. Beatrice Vance appeared at my side. Julian's mother was a retired real estate agent drowning in a sea of personal debt. She masked her impending financial ruin behind leased Mercedes sedans and imitation designer handbags. She worshipped Julian's newfound corporate wealth, eagerly reaping the benefits of his dramatically inflated salary. She hated me, She viewed my deliberate frugality as an embarrassment to the high society family image she was desperately trying to project. Beatrice held a flute of sparkling rose champagne. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering viciously on the unbranded hem of my navy dress. Navy is such a safe choice, Beatrice noted with a slow, pitying sigh. I kept my eyes fixed on the crowd. It is comfortable. Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. She turned her perfectly coiffed head, following my gaze across the room to where Victoria was now laughing loudly at something Julian had said. Victoria tossed her head back, exposing her long throat, her white suit gleaming under the hanging crystal chandeliers. Beatrice leaned closer to my ear. Julian is building an empire now. She sneered coldly. He needs a woman who looks like a boardroom, not a bake sale. The sheer cruelty of the insult hung in the air between us. It was a deliberate, calculated strike. Beatrice knew exactly what she was saying. She was giving her explicit maternal blessing to the woman currently running her manicured hands over her son's chest. She was openly endorsing my replacement. My jaw tightened. I squeezed my leather clutch until the silver clasp bit deeply into the palm of my hand. I could have destroyed her hollow reality in a single sentence. I could have told Beatrice that her son's corporate empire was built on my quiet charity. I could have told her that the vintage champagne she was currently drinking was paid for by the very woman she was insulting. Instead, I remained perfectly silent. I turned my back on Beatrice. I navigated through the thick crowd of laughing executives, determined to stand beside my husband. I reached Julian's side just as the string quartet began playing a faster, more aggressive tempo. "The catering is lovely," I said quietly, touching his forearm. Julian glanced at my hand resting on his velvet sleeve. He did not smile. He looked mildly annoyed by the interruption, before he could respond to me. Victoria shifted her weight, physically wedging her sharp shoulder between us. "Julian, you must tell them about the new server architecture." Victoria interrupted loudly, flashing a brilliant, predatory smile at the surrounding group of investors. I held my ground. "I actually read the quarterly projections." I started politely. Victoria did not even look at me. She turned her back swiftly, creating an impenetrable physical wall of white fabric. "Julian, the regional vice president is waiting," she declared over my voice. She placed her manicured hand on the small of his back. She guided him away from me, steering him toward a group of older men by the towering stained glass windows. Julian let her lead him. He did not look over his shoulder. He did not pause to introduce his wife. He simply walked away, leaving me standing alone in the center of the Bates Hall reading room. The public humiliation was suffocating. I stood perfectly still, listening to the swelling classical music and the endless clinking of crystal glasses. I watched Victoria lean dangerously close to his ear to whisper something. Julian threw his head back and laughed loudly. The predatory dynamic was undeniable. She was systematically isolating him, feeding his ravenous ego with rehearsed, sycophantic adoration, and he was starving for it. I waited by the cold marble columns for 45 minutes. Julian never looked for me. He never glanced across the massive room to see if his wife had found a seat or a drink. He was wholly consumed by the intoxicating, flawless reflection of himself that Victoria projected. I finally walked over to the tall oak doors. I caught Julian's eye across the room. He was holding a fresh glass of expensive scotch. I crossed the floor and stood beside him. "I'm going home," I whispered near his ear. Julian did not look away from his scotch. "Take a cab." He waved a dismissive hand, immediately turning his attention back to Victoria. He did not ask if I was unwell. He did not offer to walk me to the coat check. I was an inconvenience. A dull navy blue reminder of the damp Somerville garage he was so desperate to erase from his history. I walked out of the Boston Public Library alone. The night air was freezing, biting sharply through the thin crepe of my dress. I stood on the wet cobblestone sidewalk, watching the sleek black town cars idle at the curb. The profound injustice of the evening settled deep into my bones, heavy and cold. I had sacrificed my own identity to protect his fragile pride. I had quietly funded his impossible dreams to save him from absolute despair. In return, he had handed his loyalty to a woman who wore my money better than I did. Victoria Rollins was not just a chief operating officer. She was a tangible, aggressive threat. And Beatrice Vance was her willing, vicious accomplice. I hailed a yellow taxi. I watched the blurred city lights streak across the rain-streaked window, calculating the exact emotional cost of my continued silence. The entire foundation of his arrogance was built solely on my proxy capital. The gala was merely a symptom of a much deeper, more insidious rot spreading through his character. I just did not know yet exactly how far that rot had spread. But our anniversary was fast approaching, and the expensive illusion was about to crack wide open. October arrived in Boston with a sharp, biting wind that stripped the elm trees bare. Our second anniversary loomed on the calendar like a dark, impending deadline. Since the disastrous library gala, Julian and I had existed as passing ghosts in our own home. We had recently moved from the damp Somerville apartment into a sprawling, $1.2 million townhouse in Cambridge. My proxy firm had purchased the property outright through a blind LLC, but Julian proudly believed his soaring corporate credit score had secured the mortgage. I let him believe it. I let him claim the high ceilings, the crown molding, and the imported hardwood floors as his own personal triumphs. I desperately wanted our anniversary to serve as a quiet reset. I spent the late afternoon meticulously preparing for an honest, uninterrupted evening. I secured a private, candlelit booth at an exclusive Italian restaurant in the North End. I bathed in expensive oils. I brushed my hair until it shone. I deliberately left my frayed, generic cardigans in the dark corners of the closet. Instead, I wore a tailored, dark emerald silk dress, the luxurious fabric draped elegantly, whispering against the floorboards as I walked. I stood in front of the tall hallway mirror, practicing the gentle, grounding conversation I intended to initiate over a plate of handmade pasta. I wanted to ask him if he remembered the rain pounding against his garage roof. I wanted to reach the terrified, brilliant man buried underneath the tailored suits and the hollow executive arrogance. Heavy, frantic footsteps hammered against the oak staircase. Julian descended with erratic, punishing energy. I turned away from the tall mirror, smoothing the emerald silk down my thighs. Julian was not wearing his custom velvet tuxedo or a crisp dress shirt. He wore a heavy cashmere sweater and dark, designer denim. He slung a thick black leather Tom Ford duffel bag over his right shoulder. The brass hardware on the expensive bag clinked sharply against the face of his gold Rolex. "Are you ready to go?" I asked softly. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. His eyes remained fixed on the glowing digital screen of his phone. He did not notice the emerald silk. He did not notice the ambient lighting I had carefully arranged in the foyer. "I cannot make dinner," he announced flatly. My hand gripped the edge of the mahogany console table. "It is our anniversary." "I have a flight," he countered coldly. He adjusted the heavy leather strap on his shoulder. His jaw tightened into a rigid, impatient line. "There is an emergency board retreat in Aspen." He lied without hesitation. I took a slow step forward. "You never mentioned an Aspen retreat to me." "That is the definition of an emergency, Elena." He snapped back harshly. He stepped around me, charting a direct, unyielding path toward the front door. He did not offer an apology. He did not suggest rescheduling our reservation. He treated our second anniversary like a tedious calendar invite he could simply decline with a swift tap of his thumb. He reached for the heavy brass doorknob, his back already turned toward me. "Julian," I called out quietly. He paused. A sharp, irritated sigh escaped his lips. He turned his head slightly, leaning forward to press a cold, obligatory kiss against my temple. He smelled of expensive cedar cologne and sheer, unmistakable panic. "I will call you from the mountain," he promised vaguely. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, severing the lie. The Cambridge townhouse settled into a suffocating, echoing silence. I stood perfectly still in the foyer for a long, heavy hour. I listened to the faint rumble of a delivery truck shifting gears on the street outside. The antique grandfather clock ticked in a slow, mocking rhythm. I looked down at the luxurious silk of my dress. I felt like a foolish, naive child playing dress-up in an empty theater. I walked into the dimly lit kitchen. I picked up my phone and dialed the restaurant. "I need to cancel my table," I stated calmly. The restaurant hostess offered a soft, sympathetic sigh. I hung up the phone before she could offer her empty condolences. I poured a glass of cold tap water, drinking it in total silence. I climbed the long staircase back to our master bedroom. Julian had left the space in a state of chaotic, disrespectful ruin. Discarded wooden hangers littered the plush cream carpet. Dresser drawers hung open, spilling dark dress socks and expensive silk ties. A tangled pile of plastic-wrapped dry cleaning lay dumped unceremoniously across the foot of our bed. It was the careless aftermath of a man who truly believed his time was infinitely more valuable than mine. I reached behind my back and unzipped the emerald dress. I let the expensive silk pool around my ankles on the hardwood floor. I pulled on a pair of faded gray sweatpants and an oversized cotton t-shirt. I began the quiet, humiliating labor of cleaning up after my absent husband. I gathered the scattered wooden hangers. I closed the heavy dresser drawers. I remembered how he used to meticulously fold his own thrifted flannels in the Somerville garage. Terrified of wrinkling his only decent clothes, that cautious, humble man was entirely dead. I picked up a dark charcoal suit jacket from the tangled pile on the mattress. The plastic dry cleaning sheath rustled loudly in the quiet room, as I draped the heavy wool over a fresh cedar hanger. My knuckles brushed against a sharp, rigid piece of paper hidden deep inside the interior breast pocket. Julian never kept financial receipts. He considered tracking minor corporate expenses a menial task beneath his newly elevated executive status. I reached my index and middle fingers into the dark silk lining. I pulled out a crumpled, thermal-printed slip of paper. The receipt was folded over 3 times, tucked away with deliberate, calculated care. I smoothed the wrinkled edges against the polished oak surface of his dresser. The embossed logo at the top belonged to an exclusive, appointment-only jeweler located in the wealthy Back Bay neighborhood. The timestamp printed beneath the bold header was dated exactly 2 weeks ago. I read the first itemized line: custom platinum band, 3-carat emerald-cut diamond. My breath caught in the back of my throat. I traced the faded black ink with my index finger, dragging my nail across the glossy thermal paper. The final total printed at the bottom of the slip read exactly $42,000. The numbers stared back at me stark, unapologetic, and irrefutable. I looked at the shipping instructions printed beneath the grand total. The ring was not scheduled for a quiet, in-store pickup. It was scheduled for a private, insured courier delivery. The address listed was not our Cambridge townhouse. It was a luxury penthouse suite in the Seaport District. Victoria's penthouse. I did not cry. My chest did not heave with sudden, uncontrollable sobs. My hands did not tremble. The heavy, aching grief I had carried like a physical weight since the library gala evaporated in a single, defining heartbeat. It was instantly replaced by a cold, terrifying, and clinical clarity. This was not a fleeting mistake. This was not a temporary lapse in his executive judgment. Julian had walked into a high-end jewelry boutique, confidently selected a 3-carat diamond for his chief operating officer, and casually handed over a credit card. He was proposing to his mistress using the exact corporate wealth I had secretly provided. $42,000, less than 3 years ago. He had shattered a coffee mug in our kitchen because he could not pay an $8 diner tab. Now, he was dropping the equivalent of a median annual salary on a piece of jewelry for another woman. I picked up the crumpled receipt. I walked out of the chaotic bedroom and descended the oak staircase, moving with quiet, deliberate purpose. I stepped into the kitchen and placed the slip of paper dead center on the white marble island. I pressed my palms flat against the cold stone counter. I leaned over the receipt. Studying the precise geometry of the printed numbers, the betrayal had officially shifted from a lingering, toxic suspicion into tangible, physical evidence. I no longer had to guess. I no longer had to play the docile, supportive wife waiting for her husband to remember his vows. I pushed away from the marble island. I walked toward the hidden pantry door. I knelt on the hardwood floor and pulled back the corner of the heavy Persian rug. I entered a 6-digit numerical code into the flush metal keypad of the floor safe. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying, mechanical thud. I reached inside the dark, fireproof cavity. I retrieved my heavy, encrypted proxy laptop. The cold metal weighed perfectly in my hands. I carried the device back to the kitchen island, setting it down directly next to the $42,000 receipt. I lifted the lid. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across the marble. The emotional mourning period was officially over. It was time to initiate a full corporate audit. The harsh blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the dark, intricate veins running through the white marble island. I stood in the dead silence of the kitchen, staring at the blinking cursor. My hands were perfectly steady. I typed the administrative override codes for the Obsidian Ventures secure backend. My fingernails clacked sharply against the plastic keys in the quiet room. I bypassed the standard dual-factor authentication protocols, executing a direct handshake with the master server. A loading wheel spun for 3 seconds. The screen flashed green. I was no longer the docile wife standing in an empty Cambridge townhouse. I was the managing partner of a multi-million-dollar private equity firm, and I was accessing my own proprietary assets. I pulled up NovaTech's corporate general ledger. Julian thought he was untouchable. He believed the faceless investors in the financial district were too enamored with his logistical software to ever scrutinize his quarterly burn rate. I initiated a targeted forensic trace on his discretionary executive spending. The database queried the routing numbers. I filtered the expenses by location first. Julian claimed he was currently attending an emergency board retreat in Aspen, Colorado. I typed the zip code into the search bar. 0 transactions found. I cleared the search parameter. I switched the query to monitor all international expenditures charged to his primary corporate card over the last 10 months. A dense cascade of line items populated the glowing screen. The sheer volume of the financial data forced me to scroll down 3 times. I clicked on the first flagged grouping. It was a first-class flight itinerary to St. Bart's, booked precisely 3 months ago. I opened the attached digital invoices. 5 nights at an exclusive cliffside villa, $2,000 at an oceanfront seafood restaurant, a private catamaran charter. I looked at the corporate categorization code assigned to the trip. Julian had filed the entire Caribbean vacation under vendor acquisition costs. The dates aligned perfectly with a weekend he told me he was locked inside the Somerville data center dealing with a catastrophic server migration. I remembered that weekend vividly. I had baked a loaf of bread and driven to the facility in the pouring rain. I left a thermos of hot coffee on the hood of his car because he ignored my calls. He was not in the server room. He was drinking vintage champagne on a yacht, and he was using my money to do it. While I was driving a 10-year-old Honda to maintain his illusion of a hard-fought working-class climb, he was authorizing $500 room service charges. I leaned closer to the screen. My eyes scanned the subsequent lines. A long weekend at a vineyard in Napa Valley. A Michelin star tasting menu in Manhattan. $4,000 spent at a designer boutique on Fifth Avenue. Each transaction was meticulously logged and brazenly categorized as a vital corporate expense. He was hiding his infidelity in plain sight, buried beneath the bureaucratic paperwork of his own company. I calculated the burn rate in my head. He had bled over $300,000 in illicit luxury expenses in just 1 fiscal quarter. I reached for the crumpled thermal receipt resting on the marble counter. I entered the exact date of the jewelry purchase into the search field. The ledger instantly isolated the transaction. There it was. $42,000 withdrawn directly from the Obsidian Ventures seed capital. He had categorized the diamond ring as an executive retention bonus. He did not even try to obfuscate the vendor name. He assumed the faceless private equity firm would simply write off the extravagant expenditure as the standard cost of keeping a brilliant founder happy. He assumed his wife was too financially illiterate to ever uncover the paper trail. I picked up my phone from the counter. I dialed Gideon's private number. The line rang twice before the attorney answered. "Are you monitoring the NovaTech ledger?" I asked quietly. "Only the quarterly aggregates," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with sleep. I rested my palm flat against the cool marble. "Check his current executive spending." "Give me one moment," he muttered softly. I listened to the faint, rhythmic clicking of his computer mouse over the line. 4 seconds passed in heavy silence. I heard a sharp intake of breath. "This is blatant corporate embezzlement," Gideon stated grimly. "It is gross misconduct," I corrected him. He exhaled slowly. "He is bleeding the proxy capital. I am handling it," I promised flatly. I hung up the phone. I set the device face down on the counter. The profound depth of the betrayal settled over me. But it did not break me. It froze me. The realization washed away the lingering residue of my broken marriage. Julian was not just cheating on me with Victoria. He was using the exact $245 million I had injected into his failing company to finance his new life. Every oyster they swallowed, every first-class flight they boarded, every diamond he slid onto her finger. I had paid for it. The ultimate insult was not physical or emotional. It was entirely financial. He was stealing from the very woman he was discarding. He was standing on my shoulders to reach another woman's bed, using my own proxy capital to pay for the sheets. I disconnected the heavy laptop from the charging cable. I carried it down the hallway into my home office. I connected the device to the large industrial laser printer sitting on the credenza. I opened the master ledger file. I highlighted every single fraudulent expense report, every luxury hotel invoice, and the $42,000 ring transaction. I clicked print. The heavy machine whirred to life. The mechanical rollers engaged with a loud, rhythmic thud. The acrid smell of hot toner filled the small office. I stood over the output tray, watching the thick white pages slide out one by one. The printer ran continuously for 6 minutes, page after page of his arrogant lies, translated into cold, irrefutable data. When the machine finally fell silent, a stack of paper 2 inches thick rested in the tray. I gathered the warm sheets of paper. I walked over to my dark oak bookshelf and pulled down a thick, black leather presentation folder. I opened the brass rings. I methodically placed the ledgers inside, organizing the financial devastation in perfect chronological order. I smoothed the pages down, ensuring the margins aligned flawlessly. I walked back to the kitchen. I picked up the crumpled jewelry receipt from the marble island. I returned to the office and placed the thermal slip carefully inside the clear front pocket of the black folder. I snapped the brass rings shut. The sharp metallic click echoed through the empty townhouse. I ran my hand over the smooth, dark leather of the cover. My emotional grief evaporated. The agonizing heartbreak I had felt while waiting in the Bates Hall reading room vanished. Heartbreak is a useless luxury reserved for people who lack leverage. I had leverage. I had a 62% controlling stake, a black folder full of federal wire fraud evidence, and a husband who still believed I was wearing generic sweatpants in the dark. My quiet suppression was over. Julian's ego had demanded a docile cheerleader, and I had played the role flawlessly. I had let him believe he was a self-made titan of industry. I had let him parade his chief operating officer in front of me while insulting my wardrobe. I had let him drop a duffel bag on the floor and lie to my face about an aspen board retreat. But the numbers never lie. I placed the black folder precisely in the center of my desk. I turned off the harsh overhead light. The room plunged into pitch darkness, save for the faint ambient glow of the street lamps filtering through the window blinds. The conflict had permanently shifted. This was no longer a fractured marriage waiting for a difficult conversation over handmade pasta. It was a formal declaration of war. Julian Vance had no idea that the silent angel investor he worshipped was about to execute him. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom. I stepped over the discarded dry cleaning on the carpet. I climbed into the cold, empty bed and closed my eyes. I slept deeply, undisturbed. For the first time in 10 months, tomorrow, I would begin dismantling his empire piece by piece. The morning sunlight filtered through the heavy oak blinds of the master bedroom, casting long, geometric shadows across the duvet. I sat on the edge of the mattress, sipping a mug of black coffee. The house was dead quiet, devoid of the frantic, arrogant energy Julian usually brought into it. My phone chimed on the mahogany nightstand. The screen lit up with a new email notification. The sender was Beatrice Vance. I picked up the device. Beatrice struggled with basic technology. She often replied to all on private chains, forwarded local political spam, or attached the wrong digital files to her neighborhood association newsletters. I opened the message, expecting a mundane complaint about the Cambridge property taxes. Instead, it was a forwarded thread, sent to a local high-end event planner. Beatrice had accidentally typed my email address into the copy field instead of her own secondary account. The subject line read, Julian and Victoria. Floral arrangements. I set the coffee mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the nightstand. I read the text body. Beatrice was actively coordinating a private celebration dinner for the following week. She was requesting white orchids and imported lilies to match Victoria's specific aesthetic preferences. The thread detailed the expensive caterer, the exclusive guest list, and a champagne toast scheduled to honor the newly engaged couple. Julian had not even handed me the divorce papers yet. I was still legally his wife, sitting in the house my proxy had purchased, reading about the floral centerpieces for my replacement. I forwarded the email to my secure server. I walked down the hall to my office and printed the thread. The heavy industrial printer hummed. The paper slid into the output tray. Warm and crisp. I folded it twice and slipped it into the pocket of my dark wool coat. I drove my 10-year-old Honda out of Cambridge, navigating the winding, leaf-strewn roads toward the affluent suburb of Wellesley. The morning air was sharp and cold. The ancient oak trees lining the route glowed in vibrant shades of burnt orange and deep crimson. Beatrice resided in a sprawling manicured estate located at the end of a private gated cul-de-sac. It featured a sweeping circular driveway paved with imported cobblestones, pristine geometric landscaping, and a towering portico supported by white pillars. The property looked like a legacy estate, built on generations of old inherited wealth. It was all a hollow, carefully constructed facade. Julian paid the exorbitant monthly rent for the property. Julian leased the silver Mercedes sedan currently parked by the front steps. And I secretly funded Julian. The generational wealth Beatrice was so desperately trying to project actually belonged to the woman pulling up in the rusted sedan. I steered my battered vehicle into the circular driveway. The broken muffler rattled harshly against the pristine cobblestones, shattering the quiet suburban morning. I turned the engine off. I walked up the slate pathway, bypassing the heavy oak front door. I knew Beatrice's morning routine. I followed the wraparound porch toward the rear of the estate. The backyard overlooked a sloping, meticulously manicured lawn ending at a line of dense, towering pine trees. Beatrice sat at a black wrought iron patio table. She wore a tailored beige cashmere wrap and her signature string of South Sea pearls. She held a delicate porcelain teacup, sipping Earl Grey tea while reading a glossy lifestyle magazine. She looked up as my heavy boots crunched against the stone patio. Her expression did not register an ounce of surprise. She did not jump. She simply lowered the magazine, resting it against the glass tabletop. "You drove all the way out here in that terrible car?" Beatrice noted coldly. I walked to the edge of the glass table. I reached into my coat pocket, withdrew the folded email thread, and placed it directly over her magazine. "You copied me on the floral order," I stated evenly. Beatrice glanced down at the printed paper. Her manicured fingers did not tremble. She did not gasp or scramble for a shallow, flustered apology. She picked up her porcelain teacup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back onto the matching saucer with a soft, resonant clink. She adjusted the pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. "I suppose I did," she replied without a hint of remorse. I stood over her, studying the sharp, unyielding lines of her face. "You are planning an engagement dinner for my husband." Beatrice sighed, a soft, patronizing sound meant to belittle me. "Do not be overly dramatic, Elena. He has not filed for divorce," I reminded her quietly. She leaned back in her wrought iron chair. She looked at me with the same vicious, calculating pity she had displayed at the library gala. She surveyed my unbranded wool coat and my scuffed leather boots. To her, I was an embarrassing relic of Julian's past, a dull pebble stuck in the tread of his ascending corporate shoes. "You were a fine starter wife, Elena," Beatrice declared smoothly. The cruelty of the phrase hung in the crisp autumn air. "A starter wife," I repeated softly. She waved a dismissive hand toward the sprawling lawn. "You supported him? We appreciate your quiet little sacrifices, but Julian is building an empire now." She tapped a polished fingernail against the rim of her teacup. "He just needs a partner who can keep up," she stated ruthlessly. There it was, the signature line, the exact phrase Julian would soon use to discard me, prepackaged and delivered by his own mother. It was a shared family philosophy. They viewed marriage not as a partnership, but as a corporate ladder. You climb on the back of whoever is willing to carry you, and you step off when you reach a higher floor. I kept my hands resting inside my coat pockets. "Victoria is a corporate employee." "Victoria is his equal," Beatrice corrected sharply. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to ensure I understood my permanent eviction from their elevated reality. She needed to assert her dominance. I helped him select the diamond. Beatrice confessed with a tight, triumphant smile, my heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. "You went to the jeweler." "We spent 3 hours securing the perfect clarity," she boasted proudly. "Victoria has exquisite, expensive taste. She expects the finest things, and Julian is finally in a position to provide them." The irony was so sharp it physically ached. Julian was not providing anything. I had paid for the 3-carat diamond. I was paying for the Earl Grey tea Beatrice was currently sipping. I was paying the astronomical rent for the very patio we were standing on. They were all dancing on a stage I had secretly financed, mocking the producer from the spotlight. "He spent $42,000, I whispered to bait her. Beatrice's smile widened into a smug curve. A small price for his future. She picked up the printed email thread, folded it precisely in half, and tossed it into a nearby wicker wastebasket. She dismissed the evidence of her betrayal the exact same way she was dismissing my 10-year presence in her son's life. "I suggest you make the divorce swift and painless," Beatrice advised coldly. "You want me to go quietly," I observed calmly. "Julian will offer you a generous settlement," she lied flawlessly. "Take it. Return to your little financial job. Let him move forward." I stood perfectly still. I absorbed the sheer, unadulterated cruelty radiating from the woman across the table. Any lingering trace of guilt I harbored about my impending retaliation dissolved. Up until this very moment, a small, quiet fraction of my conscience had worried about the collateral damage. Destroying NovaTech meant cutting off Julian's inflated salary, which in turn meant cutting off Beatrice's allowance. I had wondered if it was fair to ruin an older woman's life, simply because her son was a traitor. I had wrestled with the ethical weight of pulling the proxy capital, knowing it would plunge this woman back into the financial ruin she was hiding from. Beatrice had just answered that question. She was not an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. She was an active, willing participant in my humiliation. She had smiled in my face while coordinating the floral arrangements for my replacement. She had examined diamonds purchased with my stolen proxy funds. She viewed my pain as a necessary, insignificant stepping stone for her son's social ascension. This removed the final ethical barrier. I no longer felt any moral obligation to spare the Vance family from the coming financial slaughter. The ledger was clean. I looked down at Beatrice. I did not scream. I did not overturn the wrought iron table. I offered her a slow, definitive nod. I will give Julian exactly what he has earned, I promised softly. Beatrice smiled, misinterpreting my statement as total submission. You are finally showing some sense, Elena. I turned my back on the patio. I walked down the wraparound porch, feeling the cold morning wind brush against my face. I stepped off the pristine slate pathway and approached my rusted Honda. I pulled the car door open. The metallic groan echoed across the quiet, affluent cul-de-sac. I sat in the worn driver's seat. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white against the plastic. The internal conflict was resolved. The black leather folder sitting on my home office desk was no longer just a defensive measure. It was a targeted weapon. I turned the ignition key. The loud, broken muffler roared to life, disturbing the serene, manicured perfection of Beatrice's stolen reality. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the estate, leaving the enabling matriarch to drink her tea in peace. Her peaceful mornings were mathematically numbered. Julian returned exactly 3 days later. The heavy oak front door opened with a sharp, metallic click, shattering the manufactured piece of the Cambridge townhouse. I stood in the kitchen, pouring a glass of cold water from the refrigerator dispenser. I did not move to greet him in the foyer. I simply listened to the thud of his expensive leather boots against the imported hardwood floors. He walked into the kitchen, dropping his Tom Ford duffel bag onto the floor. He did not look like a chief executive officer returning from a grueling, high-altitude board retreat in Aspen. His skin held a fresh, golden tan. He smelled faintly of coconut sunscreen, expensive aviation fuel, and sea salt. His eyes were hidden behind dark designer sunglasses, which he slowly pulled down and hooked onto the collar of his cashmere sweater. He did not offer a greeting. He did not apologize for abandoning our anniversary dinner. He reached into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket. He withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope. He tossed it onto the white marble island. The thick paper landed with a dull, definitive smack. We need to have a serious conversation, Julian announced stiffly, removing his coat. I set my water glass down. I am listening. He placed both hands on the edge of the marble, leaning forward to project an aura of weary authority. He had rehearsed this moment. I could see the rigid preparation in the set of his shoulders, the deliberate pacing of his breath. He was preparing to deliver a corporate termination, treating our marriage like an underperforming regional branch he was eager to liquidate. He slid the manila envelope a few inches toward me. The tab was unsealed. My lawyers drafted a marital settlement agreement, he stated coldly. I looked down at the brown paper. I did not reach for it. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me, observing the man I had secretly funded, secretly protected, and secretly saved. The arrogance radiating from him was palpable. You are bypassing mediation, I observed quietly. He sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound designed to convey profound exhaustion. He stood up straight. Pacing a tight circle on the hardwood floor, he was preparing to deliver his grand, patronizing soliloquy. This company consumes my entire existence. Elena, Julian lectured smoothly. I require the stability of this house to maintain my executive focus, and I have earned the right to keep it. He stopped pacing, anchoring himself across the marble island. I just need a partner who can keep up, he declared ruthlessly. The signature line echoed in the quiet kitchen. His mother had delivered the exact same phrasing on her manicured patio just 2 days prior. They had collaborated on my dismissal. They had crafted a shared, toxic narrative where Julian was a burdened titan of industry, chained to an unambitious, mediocre wife. I reached out and pulled the manila envelope toward my chest. I opened the unsealed flap. I withdrew a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. The bold heading at the top of the first page read, Marital Settlement and Asset Division Agreement. I have outlined a fair distribution, Julian continued smoothly. He waited to absorb my devastation to feed his own ravenous ego. He expected tears. He expected a dramatic, shattering emotional breakdown. I flipped to the second page, scanning the formal asset distribution demands. The sheer, unadulterated greed documented on the paper was staggering. Julian formally demanded full, uncontested ownership of the Cambridge townhouse. He listed the $1.2 million property as a necessary asset for his professional image. I had purchased this specific townhouse through an anonymous LLC, deliberately shielding the deed behind layers of proxy corporate registration to protect his fragile pride. He had never paid a single mortgage premium, yet he stood in my kitchen, staking a legal claim to my quiet charity. Furthermore, he explicitly requested exactly 50% of my personal, visible savings account. He was drawing an $850,000 visible salary, artificially inflated by my hidden capital. Yet, he was legally demanding half of the $60,000 I had carefully maintained in a standard checking account to uphold the illusion of my modest corporate career. But the most crucial clause was buried on page 4. I ran my index finger down the dense legal text. Julian had instructed his attorneys to explicitly isolate his company. The document mandated that NovaTech, including all its associated equity, assets, and liabilities, would remain his sole and separate property. He wanted to ensure that his frugal, financially illiterate wife could never stake a claim to his soaring corporate empire. He wanted to sever my legal connection to the company entirely before his public engagement to Victoria. By demanding total ownership, he was unknowingly assuming total liability. He wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. You want the townhouse, I noted calmly. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. I earn the stability it provides. And my savings account? I asked flatly. He scoffed, adjusting the gold Rolex on his wrist. We share our liquid assets, Elena. But you keep NovaTech entirely separate. I clarified smoothly. I built that company with my own hands. He snapped back harshly. He was weaponizing basic legal jargon, attempting to intimidate a woman who routinely navigated multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions. He believed I would cower under the threat of a prolonged legal battle. He assumed I lacked the financial literacy to understand the binding nature of the contract. He thought he was executing a flawless, unilateral victory. I flipped to the final page of the document. It was the execution block. By signing the single line of ink at the bottom, this document would become a legally binding contract. I would officially forfeit my marital claim to the townhouse and my modest savings. But I would also legally sever myself from the catastrophic financial crater that NovaTech was about to become. I looked up from the heavy bond paper. I stared directly into Julian's eyes. He shifted his weight nervously. The prolonged silence was unnerving him. The script he had meticulously rehearsed in his head was unraveling. The weeping, desperate wife he anticipated had failed to materialize. Instead, a cold, analytical stillness had settled over the kitchen. I reached into the front pocket of my cardigan. I pulled out a heavy, black titanium pen. I clicked the top of the pen. The sharp, mechanical snap severed the heavy tension in the room. I pressed the metal tip against the bottom line of the final page. I did not argue. I did not scream about the platinum ring, the offshore dummy accounts, or the first-class flights to St. Bart's. I did not mention his mother, the floral arrangements, or the absolute fallacy of his entire corporate existence. I simply pressed the ink into the paper. I signed my full legal name in smooth, unwavering cursive. Julian's jaw dropped slightly. His arms uncrossed. A deep, unsettling confusion washed over his tanned face. He took a hesitant step toward the marble island. I capped the titanium pen. I slid the signed agreement back across the smooth stone surface. "You are signing it," he whispered in shock. I tucked the pen back into my pocket. "I am agreeing to your terms." He stared down at my fresh signature. His breathing turned shallow. The profound lack of resistance disturbed him deeply. A man whose entire identity was built on aggressive corporate combat did not know how to process an immediate, unconditional surrender. He reached out and touched the edge of the paper, as if verifying the ink was real. "You are not fighting for the house?" he asked suspiciously. "Do not drag this out," I warned sharply, echoing his own anticipated arguments. I offered him a cold, empty smile. "There will be no fight, Julian." I turned my back on him. I walked toward the hidden pantry door, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen with his signed marital settlement agreement. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not need to see the confusion festering in his eyes. By signing the settlement, I had executed a vital, strategic maneuver. I had legally formalized the financial severance of our relationship. The liability was officially contained. I was no longer an aggrieved, emotional spouse begging for fidelity. I was a hostile corporate entity preparing to liquidate a toxic asset, and I possessed a signed contract proving I had zero personal responsibility for the impending collapse. The runway was entirely clear. Julian believed he had just successfully discarded a mediocre, uninspired wife. He believed he had secured the $1.2 million townhouse. He believed he was free to marry Victoria Rollins and rule the Seaport District with absolute impunity. He was wrong on every single count. I walked into my home office and locked the heavy oak door. I retrieved the thick black leather folder from my desk drawer. I ran my fingers over the smooth brass rings, feeling the solid weight of the fraudulent ledgers, the stolen capital logs, and the $42,000 thermal receipt. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to the financial district. "Prepare the liquidation order," I instructed the moment the call connected. Gideon's deep voice resonated through the speaker. "I will have it waiting on my desk." I hung up the phone. I grabbed my dark wool coat from the back of my desk chair. Julian had demanded a separation, claiming we were walking different paths. He was entirely correct. His path led directly to total, unmitigated ruin. My path led to Gideon's mahogany boardroom. The emotional mourning period was officially dead. The financial execution was ready to commence. I left Julian standing in the kitchen with the signed settlement agreement. I walked out of the Cambridge townhouse and stepped into the bitter October wind. The sky above the historic neighborhood had turned the color of bruised iron. I slid into the driver's seat of my dented 10-year-old Honda. The worn vinyl creaked under my weight. I turned the ignition key. The engine sputtered, the rusted muffler rattling against the pristine cobblestone driveway. I shifted the car into gear and steered toward the financial district. The drive took 34 minutes. I navigated the dense, sluggish afternoon traffic stretching across the Longfellow Bridge. The Charles River churned below, gray and unforgiving. I did not turn on the radio. I listened to the rhythmic, squeaking sweep of the windshield wipers pushing away the initial drops of autumn rain. For the past 10 months, I had driven this exact route carrying the suffocating weight of a failing marriage. I had agonized over Julian's late nights, his sudden obsession with designer labels, and the growing emotional chasm between us. I had blamed myself. I had worn frayed cardigans and kept my voice low, terrified of triggering his explosive insecurities. That version of me died the moment I found the thermal jewelry receipt. I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper. The concrete pillars were painted stark yellow. I parked the Honda between a sleek black Porsche and a silver Audi, ignoring the sharp contrast. I grabbed the thick black leather folder from the passenger seat. I walked toward the private, secured elevator bank reserved for executive principals. I swiped my encrypted proxy card. The heavy steel doors slid open. The elevator ascended 42 floors in a smooth, silent rush. My ears popped as the atmospheric pressure shifted. The doors parted, revealing the hushed, deeply insulated reception area of Obsidian Ventures. The air smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and expensive leather. There were no flashing corporate logos. There were no ping-pong tables or neon signs boasting about disruptive technology. This was a realm of old, entrenched power. This was my realm. Gideon's executive assistant sat behind a curved mahogany desk. She looked up from her dual monitors, recognizing me instantly. She did not ask for my name. She simply nodded, stood up, and opened the heavy double doors leading into the senior partner's inner sanctum. Gideon sat behind a sprawling desk carved from a single piece of dark walnut. He wore a charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him framed a sweeping, panoramic view of the Boston Harbor. Rain lashed against the thick glass, obscuring the distant cargo ships. I walked across the plush wool carpet. I took my seat in the high-backed leather chair opposite him. I placed the black folder directly onto the polished wood. Gideon did not offer a warm greeting. He understood the gravity of my unannounced arrival. He reached out and opened the brass rings of the folder. He spent 7 quiet minutes reviewing the printed ledgers, the fraudulent expense reports, and the $42,000 receipt. The only sound in the office was the sharp turning of paper and the rain hitting the window pane. Gideon closed the folder. His face remained an unreadable mask of professional detachment, but his jaw tightened. He opened a locked side drawer of his desk. He withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. A bright red tab protruded from the top page. He placed the stack squarely in front of me. "This is the formal liquidation order," Gideon stated evenly, folding his hands over the desk blotter. I looked down at the dense legal text. "Explain the mechanism." Gideon adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "We are invoking Section 4 of the proxy agreement. This triggers an immediate, non-negotiable recall of the $245 million in capital backing." He tapped the red tab with his index finger. "The justification is gross executive misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "The evidence of wire fraud you provided is irrefutable. Julian Vance has systematically embezzled corporate funds to finance personal luxury expenditures. Upon your signature, NovaTech will be deemed an insolvent, toxic asset." I stared at the stark black ink on the heavy bond paper. This single document carried the destructive force of a hurricane. It would not just end Julian's career, it would obliterate his entire reality. The corporate credit cards, the leased seaport office space, the server hosting fees, the payroll for 200 employees, all of it relied exclusively on the Obsidian Ventures liquidity pool. Without my money, Julian was just a man standing in a leased suit. "Does the freeze happen instantaneously?" I asked calmly. Gideon nodded once. "The moment I instruct the banking tier, all associated routing numbers and SWIFT codes are locked. His corporate access will be revoked. His operating accounts will drop to zero. The commercial leases tied to the proxy guarantor will immediately default." I reached into my pocket and retrieved the heavy titanium pen, the same pen I had used less than an hour ago to sign the marital settlement. Gideon leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. The senior attorney shed his corporate armor for a brief, fleeting second, looking at me with the protective concern of a father. "This action is irreversible, Elena," Gideon warned softly. "Are you entirely certain?" I held the titanium pen over the signature line. I thought about Beatrice sipping her Earl Grey tea, boasting about selecting a 3-carat diamond for my replacement. I thought about Julian dropping the divorce papers on the kitchen island, demanding my modest savings account because he needed a partner who could keep up. They had constructed a gilded, arrogant world using my stolen wealth, and they had locked me out of it. I met Gideon's gaze. I did not flinch. "Some investments require a total write-off," I replied coldly. I pressed the pen to the paper. I signed my name with a sharp, aggressive slash of ink. I slid the red-tabbed liquidation order back across the walnut desk. Gideon picked up the document. He verified the signature, his expression hardening back into professional resolve. He set the paper aside and picked up the sleek black receiver of his secure telephone. He pressed a single speed dial button. Initiate Protocol Black on the NovaTech portfolio, Gideon instructed the banking team. He paused, listening to the confirmation on the other end. Lock all corporate routing numbers, he ordered firmly. Freeze the primary operating accounts. Nullify the executive lines of credit. Do it now. Gideon placed the receiver back onto the cradle. The soft click echoed in the quiet office. It was done. In that singular physical action, the invisible financial scaffolding holding up Julian's entire existence was forcefully kicked away. There were no screaming matches. There were no shattered plates or tearful confrontations. The destruction of Julian Vance was executed with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a keystroke in a silent, mahogany-paneled room. I turned my head, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The autumn storm had intensified, blanketing the Boston harbor in a thick, gray haze. Somewhere in the city, Julian was likely packing his Tom Ford duffel bag for a celebratory dinner with Victoria. He was likely adjusting his gold Rolex, admiring his reflection in a mirror, believing he had just successfully discarded the heaviest anchor in his life. He did not know the floor had just vanished beneath his feet. The proxy server banks were already transmitting the freeze protocols. The algorithms were severing his access to the $245 million. Every single corporate credit card bearing his name was currently turning into a useless piece of plastic. His digital keycards were deactivating. The luxury lifestyle he had stolen from me was actively collapsing in real time, racing toward him like a silent, invisible shockwave. I sat back in the leather chair, feeling a profound, chilling sense of peace. How long until he feels the impact? I asked quietly, keeping my eyes on the rain-streaked glass. Gideon checked the silver face of his watch. He smoothed his silk tie. Less than 2 hours, Gideon predicted grimly. I nodded slowly. The ticking clock was set. I pictured the exact sequence of events. Julian would reach for the check at whatever high-end restaurant he had chosen for his evening celebration. He would offer his platinum corporate card with that practiced, dismissive flick of his wrist. The server would walk away, only to return minutes later with an apologetic whisper. Julian would laugh, assuming a simple bank error. He would offer a secondary card. That one would decline too. The flush of embarrassment would creep up his neck. The arrogant facade would crack, exposing the terrified, insecure man I used to comfort on a cold garage floor. He had demanded the Cambridge townhouse because he claimed to have earned the stability. By dinner time, he would not even be able to purchase a glass of tap water under his corporate banner. I stood up from the leather chair. I picked up my dark wool coat. Keep me updated on the localized fallout, I told Gideon. My office will monitor the banking rejections, Gideon promised, standing up to respectfully mirror my departure. Enjoy your evening, Elena. I walked out of the mahogany-paneled room. The heavy double doors closed softly behind me, sealing the financial tomb. I stepped back into the silent elevator, pressing the button for the parking garage. The descent felt remarkably light. I had shed the suffocating weight of my false identity. The frugal, docile wife in the frayed cardigan was gone forever. The architect had reclaimed her portfolio. I stepped out into the damp, yellow-lit concrete of the parking garage, walking toward my rusted Honda with my head held high. The storm was just beginning. I returned to the empty Cambridge townhouse just as the autumn storm broke fully over the city. I did not take off my damp wool coat. I walked straight into my home office, locked the heavy oak door, and opened the proxy laptop. The Obsidian Ventures transaction monitor glowed with a harsh, clinical blue light against the dark mahogany walls. I sat in the leather chair, watching the digital map of Julian's life. The liquidation protocol was a silent, invisible executioner. It did not carry a scythe or shout an accusation. It carried relentless algorithms, cascading through the global banking tiers, severing corporate arteries one by one, at 7 o'clock. The first red indicator flashed on my screen. Julian was sitting in a velvet booth at an exclusive, dimly lit steakhouse in the Seaport district. He was celebrating his newly minted engagement to Victoria, shielded from the rain, draped in his expensive cashmere sweater. I watched the location ping on the corporate ledger network. I knew exactly how he operated in these environments. He would lean back against the plush upholstery, projecting the hollow aura of a self-made titan. He would speak loudly, ensuring the adjacent tables heard him discussing server architectures and venture capital. A pending charge hit the Obsidian Gateway server. $3,000. He was attempting to order a rare, vintage Bordeaux to pair with their imported Wagyu. I watched the pulsing yellow authorization request hover on my screen. The banking algorithm recognized the frozen routing number. The protocol engaged. The yellow light snapped to a hard, unforgiving red. Transaction denied. Code account suspended. I imagined the waiter returning to the velvet booth, his posture stiff with professional discomfort. He would lean down, shielding the leather checkbook from Victoria's view, and whisper the humiliating truth. Julian would laugh. He would offer a dismissive, arrogant wave of his hand, blaming a localized banking glitch or an overzealous fraud prevention trigger. He would reach into his designer wallet to produce his personal platinum card, eager to resolve the minor inconvenience and protect his image. A second authorization request hit my screen 2 minutes later. Julian did not realize his personal checking accounts were tethered directly to the NovaTech executive guarantor lines. When Obsidian Ventures pulled the structural foundation, the entire financial house collapsed simultaneously. The secondary card pinged the gateway. Red. Transaction denied. I traced my finger over the smooth glass of my laptop screen, observing the digital rejection. The absolute mortification must have burned the back of his neck. Victoria would be watching him from across the candle-lit table, her sharp eyes calculating the sudden, inexplicable delay. Julian hated looking weak. He despised the scent of poverty above all else. My screen refreshed. The corporate mobile network logged an outgoing call. Julian had excused himself from the velvet booth, stepping out into the freezing October downpour to call his chief financial officer. I did not need an audio tap to know how that conversation unfolded. The CFO had been staring at a similar screen for the past hour, hyperventilating into a paper bag. The executive banking portal was locked. The corporate payroll accounts, scheduled to disperse funds to 200 employees at midnight, were currently showing a balance of absolute zero. The invisible venture capital firm that had birthed NovaTech had just slit its throat without a single warning email. I watched the call duration tick upward. 4 minutes, 7 minutes. Julian was standing on the wet cobblestones, the cold rain soaking through his expensive cashmere. The CFO was likely screaming through the receiver, demanding to know what catastrophic executive error Julian had committed to trigger a hard exit liquidation clause. The $245 million safety net was entirely gone. The call abruptly terminated. Julian's GPS beacon moved erratically across the digital map. He was running. He was fleeing the steakhouse, abandoning Victoria at the table with the unpaid bill and the imported Wagyu. The sheer panic had overridden his meticulous corporate vanity. He needed to reach the Seaport office. He needed to sit behind his desk and access the primary terminals to prove the financial apocalypse was just a temporary software bug. He ran to the valet stand. I clicked open the Asset Management tab on the proxy portal. Julian drove a custom black Porsche Panamera. The vehicle was technically leased under a NovaTech commercial fleet contract. When Gideon initiated the freeze, the automated repossession clauses hard-coded into the high-risk exotic lease agreements immediately activated. The dealership held a zero-tolerance policy for insolvent corporate guarantors. The GPS tracker embedded in the Porsche dashboard pinged. It was no longer idling in the underground valet garage. It was moving steadily toward the interstate. I leaned back in my chair, picturing the scene playing out under the yellow street lamps. Julian would sprint up to the valet podium, tossing his ticket onto the metal counter, breathless and frantic. The valet attendant would look at him with wide, confused eyes. He would simply point toward the wet street. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck was already pulling away from the curb. The sleek black Porsche securely hitched to the hydraulic lift. Julian would stand on the sidewalk, his expensive leather boots submerged in a shallow puddle. He would watch the red taillights of his status symbol disappear into the driving rain. The ultimate display of his manufactured dominance was physically dragged away into the dark. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a secure message from Gideon's internal IT department. The text contained a live log of incoming communications hitting the Obsidian Ventures firewall. Julian was frantically dialing the proxy contact numbers, the same numbers he had proudly saved in his phone 10 months ago when he believed he had outsmarted the entire technology sector. He was standing in the storm, his wet fingers slipping against the glass screen, desperate to reach the faceless venture capitalists. Incoming call, Julian Vance. Status blocked. Incoming call, Julian Vance. Status blocked. The firewall rejected the connections with ruthless efficiency. He was getting nothing but dead dial tones. The silence on the other end of the line was a weapon I had specifically requested. I wanted him to feel the exact same isolating, suffocating disregard he had shown me when he dropped his duffel bag and walked out the door. I wanted him to understand that he possessed absolutely no leverage. He was locked out of the castle he thought he owned. I closed the IT log. The blue light from the monitor reflected in the dark window pane of my office. For 10 months, I had carefully managed his fragile ego, walking on eggshells, silencing my own identity to keep his demons at bay. I had allowed him to treat me like a disposable accessory. I had allowed him to parade his chief operating officer in front of me, enduring the subtle sneers and the patronizing insults. He had demanded the $1.2 million townhouse because he needed a partner who could keep up. He was currently standing on a street corner, soaking wet, entirely incapable of paying for a taxi ride home. The boardroom panic was bleeding out into the street. NovaTech was effectively dead. The corporate shell would continue to exist on paper for a few more days, tangled in litigation and bankruptcy filings. But the engine was permanently stalled. I stood up from the leather chair. My joints ached with a deep, lingering exhaustion, but my mind was crystalline and sharp. The financial execution was proceeding flawlessly. However, the emotional toll of the betrayal still lingered in the quiet corners of the house. I walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of cold water. The heavy oak front door suddenly rattled. I froze, the glass halfway to my mouth. I checked the time on the oven display. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Julian had no car. His credit cards were frozen, and he was stranded miles away in the seaport. He could not possibly be rattling the front door of the Cambridge townhouse. The doorbell chimed. 3 sharp, urgent rings cut through the silent house. I set the glass down on the marble island. I tightened the belt of my wool coat, walking slowly toward the foyer. I glanced at the digital security monitor mounted on the wall. It was not Julian standing on the rain-slicked porch. The man staring into the camera lens was tall, with broad shoulders hidden under a dark trench coat. He held a thick, heavy metallic briefcase pressed tightly against his side. Water dripped from the brim of his dark hat. I recognized him immediately. It was Marcus Vance. Julian's adopted brother was a senior forensic accountant for a rival firm. He was a quiet, intensely observant man who had always viewed Julian's rapid corporate ascent with deep, unyielding skepticism. Marcus despised the arrogance Julian wore like a second skin. More importantly, Marcus possessed a brilliant, surgical mind for identifying financial anomalies. I pressed the intercom button. "It is late, Marcus," I said cautiously. Marcus leaned closer to the camera. Rain lashed against his face, but his expression remained grim and unmoving. "The numbers never lie, Elena," Marcus stated clearly through the static of the speaker. "People do." I exhaled slowly. He was quoting his own professional mantra. He was not here to defend his brother. He was here as an auditor. I reached out and unbolted the heavy oak door. I pulled it open, letting the cold autumn wind sweep into the warm foyer. Marcus stepped over the threshold, bringing the storm inside with him. He did not bother wiping his wet boots on the entry mat. He walked directly into the living room, setting the heavy metallic briefcase onto the glass coffee table. The locks clicked sharply as he snapped them open. The conflict was about to mutate from a simple asset freeze into a full-scale federal investigation. The sharp click of the briefcase latches echoed against the high ceiling of the living room. Marcus lifted the brushed metal lid, revealing a thick, ruggedized external hard drive resting beside a sleek black laptop. He did not remove his trench coat. Water dripped from his dark collar onto the glass coffee table. I sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, crossing my arms over my chest. Marcus extracted the laptop. Flipping the screen open, he plugged a thick braided cable into the side port, connecting the encrypted hard drive. His long fingers danced across the keyboard, bypassing security protocols with practiced, mechanical efficiency. He was 33 years old, built like a linebacker, but he possessed the quiet, meticulous precision of a watchmaker. I started tracking the discrepancies 3 months ago, Marcus stated flatly without looking up. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Julian never allowed external audits. Julian is an arrogant fool, Marcus replied, his voice dripping with clinical disgust. He hit the enter key. A sprawling, complex spreadsheet populated the screen, filled with hundreds of red-flagged routing numbers. Marcus had always operated on the periphery of the Vance family dynamic. Beatrice treated him as a charity case to boost her socialite profile, and Julian treated him as a dull, uninspired number cruncher. Marcus endured their condescension in silence, building a formidable career as a senior forensic accountant while they leased luxury cars to mask their debts. He turned the laptop toward me. I despise his vanity, Marcus confessed quietly. He pointed to a cluster of highlighted cells. But I despise Victoria Rollins even more, he added, his jaw tightening. I stared at the rows of financial data. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a mirror image of the NovaTech ledger I had accessed earlier that afternoon. But the depth of this specific audit plunged far deeper than discretionary executive spending. Marcus had dug past the offshore retreats and the expensive diamond rings. He had tunneled into the foundational architecture of the company's operational budget. You breached his firewall, I observed softly. Marcus offered a slow, grim nod. The numbers never lie. Elena. People do. He tapped the glass screen, isolating a specific column of vendor payments. Victoria is not just sleeping with your husband, Marcus explained grimly. She is actively dismantling his company from the inside. The chill in the room intensified. I looked closer at the highlighted cells. There were 6 distinct corporate entities listed under the primary software logistics budget. They bore generic, plausible names: Apex Data Solutions, Meridian Cloud Protocols, Zenith Server Management. Julian's signature authorized every single recurring invoice. The routing numbers attached to these vendors traced back to a series of holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. These are dummy IT vendors, I whispered, my heart rate accelerating. Marcus leaned back against the edge of the leather armchair. Shell corporations, registered to a proxy firm in Delaware. Who owns the proxy? I demanded sharply. Marcus pressed another key, bringing up a scanned corporate registry document. Victoria's maiden name is listed on the foundational charter. I sat perfectly still. The sheer, audacious scale of the betrayal crystallized in my mind. Julian believed he had hired a brilliant chief operating officer to manage his scaling empire. He believed he had found an equal partner, someone who matched his ruthless corporate ambitions. Instead, he had invited a serial embezzler into his bed and handed her the master keys to the treasury. How much? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus scrolled to the bottom of the master spreadsheet. The grand total rested in a heavy, undeniable red box. $4,200,000, Marcus answered coldly. I closed my eyes. $4,200,000. Victoria had not merely drained the proxy capital to fund luxury vacations and designer wardrobes. She was executing a systematic, premeditated heist. She was bleeding Obsidian Ventures dry, siphoning the lifeblood of the company into her own offshore accounts under the guise of vital technological infrastructure. And Julian was happily authorizing the transfers. I opened my eyes, looking at the grim reality displayed on the glowing screen. The $42,000 platinum ring was just a distraction. It was a shiny bauble tossed to a narcissist to keep him distracted while she robbed the vault. Victoria laughed at his jokes, stroked his chest at corporate galas, and fed his ravenous ego. She constructed a flawless illusion of devotion, blinding him to the hemorrhaging balance sheets. He signed the invoices, I noted, pointing at the digital authorization stamps. Marcus nodded again, his expression hardening. She manipulated him into rubber stamping every single fraudulent contract. The true brilliance of Victoria's endgame washed over me, cold and suffocating. She was not planning to marry Julian Vance. The engagement dinner Beatrice was currently arranging with white orchids and imported lilies was a farce. Victoria was securing her exit strategy. She is going to leave him, I deduced flatly. Worse, Marcus corrected, folding his arms across his trench coat. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine. She is going to bankrupt NovaTech, wire the remaining capital offshore, and disappear. He warned gravely. The federal implications hit me like a physical blow. Julian was the chief executive officer. His digital signature rested on every single forged vendor contract. When the Securities and Exchange Commission eventually audited the smoking crater of NovaTech, they would not find Victoria Rollins. They would find Julian Vance holding the bag for a multi-million-dollar wire fraud operation. Victoria was not just stealing my money, she was framing my husband for a federal crime. I stood up from the velvet sofa. I paced the length of the living room, my boots echoing against the hardwood. The stakes had just leaped from a bitter, vindictive divorce into the realm of federal prosecution. If the authorities traced the dummy vendors before I could contain the fallout, the collateral damage would spread. The investigation would inevitably drag Obsidian Ventures into the spotlight, exposing my hidden identity and subjecting my generational trust to a grueling public autopsy. I stopped pacing. I turned back to face Marcus. You brought this directly to me, I stated carefully. Marcus closed the laptop, the screen going dark. I knew Julian did not have the intellect to secure that seed funding on his own. He unlatched the braided cable and slid the hard drive toward the center of the glass table. I always suspected you were the architect, he confessed softly. I looked at the heavy, encrypted drive. It contained enough evidence to send both Victoria and Julian to a federal penitentiary for a decade. Marcus could have taken this directly to the authorities. He could have delivered it to a rival tech firm for a lucrative bounty. Instead, he had walked through a freezing autumn storm to place the weapon directly into my hands. Why give this to me? I asked, testing his loyalty. Marcus stood up. He adjusted the collar of his damp trench coat. Because Beatrice and Julian treated you exactly the way they treated me, Marcus answered, his voice thick with decades of suppressed resentment. He stepped around the coffee table, stopping an arm's length away. They think we are invisible, he added grimly. The shared grievance forged an instant, unbreakable bond. We were the discarded collateral of the Vance family vanity. They had underestimated his brilliance, assuming he was too dull to audit their gilded reality. They had underestimated my power, assuming I was too timid to shatter their illusions. We both understood the exact price of their arrogance, and we were both ready to collect the debt. I reached out my right hand. Marcus looked at my outstretched fingers for a fraction of a second. He gripped my hand firmly. His palm was rough and cold from the storm outside, but his grip conveyed absolute, unwavering solidarity. We shook hands in the quiet living room, sealing an unspoken pact. We were no longer just observers standing on the periphery of Julian's manufactured empire. We were active accomplices in its destruction. Keep monitoring her offshore routing numbers, I instructed smoothly. I have a script running constantly, Marcus confirmed. He released my hand. He walked toward the foyer, the heavy rubber soles of his boots squeaking slightly on the hardwood floor. He paused with his hand resting on the brass doorknob. Julian is going to try to crawl back, Marcus warned over his shoulder. He has nowhere else to go. I agreed coldly. Marcus opened the door, stepping back out into the driving rain. He pulled the door shut, the latch clicking securely into place. I walked back to the glass coffee table. I picked up the encrypted hard drive. The metal casing felt heavy, dense with toxic secrets. The conflict had officially escalated far beyond the realm of marital infidelity. I was holding the absolute proof of $4,200,000 in stolen proxy capital. Victoria Rollins thought she was a corporate apex predator. She thought she had found the perfect, gullible mark to finance her golden parachute. She did not realize the mark's wife owned the parachute company. I carried the hard drive down the hall to my office. I locked the door and connected the device to my master terminal. I began cloning the evidence, preparing to weave the embezzlement ledgers into my final strike. The financial guillotine was fully assembled. Now, I just had to wait for the desperate, panicked targets to stick their necks into the block. The autumn storm broke just before dawn, leaving the Cambridge streets washed clean and littered with wet, amber leaves. I stood by the kitchen window, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The financial execution I had initiated the previous afternoon was currently tearing through the global banking tiers. But the localized fallout had not yet reached the manicured suburbs. A sleek, silver Mercedes sedan rolled onto my cobblestone driveway. The heavy tires crushed the fallen elm leaves with a distinct, wealthy crunch. Beatrice Vance shifted the car into park. She stepped out into the crisp morning air, wearing a tailored beige trench coat and her signature string of South Sea pearls. She retrieved a designer leather handbag from the passenger seat, draped it over her forearm, and walked up my front steps. She did not ring the doorbell. She bypassed basic courtesy entirely, sliding her emergency spare key into the brass deadbolt. The heavy oak door swung open. Beatrice stepped into the foyer, wiping the soles of her expensive leather boots on the entry mat with deliberate, aggressive force. "I expected you to be packing," Beatrice announced loudly, her voice echoing down the hallway. I did not move from my spot by the kitchen window. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching her march into the center of my home. She carried herself with the triumphant, untouchable posture of a conquering monarch inspecting a newly acquired territory. She believed the signed settlement agreement had successfully secured this $1.2 million property. She believed she was standing in her son's house. Beatrice reached the white marble island. She unclasped her designer handbag, her gold bracelets clinking sharply against the metal hardware. "Julian is far too busy navigating corporate acquisitions to handle domestic unpleasantness," Beatrice stated dismissively, not bothering to make eye contact. She reached into the dark velvet lining of her bag. She withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. She placed it squarely on the marble surface and pushed it across the stone with two manicured fingers. The envelope slid to a halt exactly 6 inches from my coffee mug. "What is this?" I asked quietly, keeping my hands wrapped around my warm ceramic mug. Beatrice offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Consider it a generous severance package." I looked down at the unsealed envelope. I did not reach for it. "Julian and Victoria are planning a public engagement gala next month," Beatrice continued, her tone dripping with rehearsed superiority. "It will be heavily documented by the local business press. We cannot afford the distraction of a bitter, lingering starter wife contesting a standard divorce settlement. This is to ensure you go away quietly." She tapped her polished fingernail against the thick paper. "It is a personal check for $50,000. she declared proudly. I stared at her manicured finger. $50,000. It was a pathetic, insulting sum. It was $8,000 more than Julian had spent on Victoria's platinum diamond ring, and it was drawn from an account I had secretly funded. Beatrice was attempting to bribe the silent architect of her entire reality using a fraction of the architect's own stolen money. You believe this covers my silence? I observed softly. Beatrice sighed, adjusting the cashmere scarf around her neck. It is far more than you deserve, Elena. Julian is ascending into a different echelon of society. Victoria possesses the proper breeding for his new trajectory. She understands legacy. You simply do not fit into the architecture of his future. She leaned slightly over the counter, her eyes narrowing into cold, malicious slits. Take the check, Elena, she ordered harshly. Move out by Friday. Return to whatever little financial cubicle you crawled out of, and let my son build his empire in peace. I set my coffee mug down. The ceramic base clicked against the stone. I reached out and picked up the cream-colored envelope. I pulled back the flap and extracted the personal check. Beatrice had filled it out in her own sprawling, elegant cursive. The ink was perfectly blue. The routing numbers at the bottom traced directly to the joint checking account she shared with Julian, an account directly tethered to the Obsidian Ventures executive liquidity lines. Beatrice watched me study the paper, her smile widening into a mask of pure, unadulterated hubris. She assumed my silence indicated submission. She assumed the sight of $50,000 had overwhelmed my modest, working-class sensibilities. I turned my back to her. I walked 3 steps toward the small home office alcove tucked adjacent to the kitchen pantry. A heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder sat discreetly beneath the oak desk. I reached down and pressed the primary power switch. The machine hummed to life, a low, mechanical growl vibrating against the hardwood floor. What are you doing? Beatrice demanded sharply, her triumphant tone fracturing. I did not answer. I held the $50,000 check directly over the silver feed slot. I let go. The steel blades caught the thick paper instantly. The shredder roared, devouring the check and the cream-colored envelope in less than 3 seconds. The machine spat a chaotic pile of tiny, illegible white confetti into the clear plastic bin. I pressed the power button again, plunging the kitchen back into dead silence. I turned around, leaning my hips against the edge of the desk. Beatrice stood frozen by the marble island. Her mouth hung slightly open. The color had entirely drained from her perfectly powdered cheeks. She looked at the plastic shredder bin, unable to process the visceral destruction of what she considered a massive sum of wealth. You are insane, Beatrice whispered breathlessly. I pushed off the desk, walking slowly back to the marble island. I leaned over the cool stone, closing the physical distance between us. I looked directly into her wide, terrified eyes. The psychological warfare had officially shifted to the enablers, and I was holding a nuclear arsenal. That check was worthless, I informed her quietly. Beatrice gripped the strap of her designer handbag. That is a certified personal draft, huh? Julian's corporate accounts are locked, I corrected smoothly, my voice devoid of any sympathy. His executive lines of credit are frozen. The primary routing numbers associated with your joint checking account were severed by the venture capital firm yesterday afternoon. Her chest heaved. A frantic, desperate denial washed over her features. You are lying, she hissed through clenched teeth. Julian is the chief executive officer. Julian is insolvent, I countered coldly. I pointed a rigid finger toward the front window, directing her attention to the silver Mercedes parked on the cobblestones. That vehicle is leased under a NovaTech commercial fleet contract, I explained, maintaining strict, analytical eye contact. The automated repossession clauses activated the moment the proxy capital was pulled. A commercial tow truck is likely already charting a route to this exact address. Beatrice took a staggering step backward. The heel of her expensive boot caught awkwardly on the edge of the Persian rug. She stumbled, her perfectly manicured hand flailing out to catch the edge of the marble counter for support. The hollow, terrifying reality of my words was actively dismantling her arrogant facade. "No," she stammered, her voice cracking violently. "No. The seed money, the investors." "The faceless investors require a total write-off," I interrupted, feeding her the signature line with surgical precision. I watched the devastating arithmetic assemble in her mind. If Julian's accounts were frozen, her monthly allowance was gone, the mortgage on her sprawling Wellesley estate would immediately default. The lease on her luxury vehicle would bounce. The catered engagement gala with the imported white orchids would become an unpaid, humiliating scandal. The high society image she had so viciously protected was about to evaporate into thin air, leaving her with absolutely nothing but aggressive debt collectors. Her entire gilded existence had just been fed into a mechanical shredder, and she was watching the confetti settle. "You," Beatrice choked out, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. "You cannot possibly know this." "I know everything," I promised softly. I walked around the marble island, charting a direct, unyielding path toward the foyer. I reached the heavy oak front door. I unbolted the lock and pulled the heavy wood inward, exposing the cold, damp morning air. I stood by the open threshold, waiting. Beatrice did not move from the kitchen. Her hands trembled violently as she clutched her imitation designer handbag against her chest. She looked like a frightened, aging woman who had just woken up from a 10-month fever dream to find her house entirely empty. "Get out of my house, Beatrice," I commanded evenly. She flinched at the harsh, undeniable authority in my tone. The condescending socialite who had sneered at my unbranded navy dress was entirely gone. She scrambled across the hardwood floor, her expensive boots sliding awkwardly as she rushed toward the exit. She did not stop to offer an apology. She did not attempt to hurl a final, desperate insult. She practically sprinted through the open doorway, fleeing the terrifying truth I had just unleashed. I stood in the foyer, watching her stumble down the front steps. She practically ripped the door of the silver Mercedes open, throwing her handbag onto the passenger seat. She fumbled with the ignition, her hands shaking so badly she could barely engage the transmission. The engine roared to life. She reversed out of the cobblestone driveway with reckless, chaotic speed, the tires spinning and throwing wet leaves across the manicured lawn. I watched the silver sedan disappear down the street, fleeing back toward Wellesley to await the inevitable arrival of the commercial repossession agents. I pushed the heavy oak door shut. The brass latch clicked securely into place. The Cambridge townhouse was silent again, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. It no longer felt like a staging ground for Julian's arrogant monologues or Beatrice's cruel ambushes. It felt like a fortified command center. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up my ceramic coffee mug. The dark roast was entirely cold, but I took a slow sip anyway. The absolute destruction of the Vance family was accelerating beyond my initial projections. Julian was stranded in the financial dark, and Beatrice was currently racing home to watch her stolen reality collapse. The emotional satisfaction was deep and resonating. I carried my coffee mug back down the hall toward my home office. I needed to verify the external hard drive Marcus had provided was fully decrypted. The corporate valuation of NovaTech was about to hit the public press, and the resulting shockwave would require my undivided attention. The countdown to Julian's ultimate public humiliation had officially reached zero. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, the financial guillotine dropped. A breaking news alert from Forbes illuminated the screen of my encrypted laptop. The headline was mercilessly brief: Obsidian Ventures liquidates, NovaTech insolvent. Gideon had timed the press release flawlessly, launching the article just as the East Coast financial markets opened for trading. The piece detailed a sudden, catastrophic withdrawal of the $245 million seed capital. It cited irreconcilable breaches of executive fiduciary duties. It did not mention the fake offshore vendors. It did not mention Victoria Rollins. It left the specific nature of the gross misconduct to the terrifying, paranoid imagination of Wall Street analysts. I sat in my home office, sipping a cup of black tea, watching the digital shockwave ripple across the sector. The corporate metrics plummeting on my dashboard felt less like raw data and more like poetry. NovaTech had boasted a $600 million valuation just 24 hours ago. That number was currently in free fall, shedding millions of dollars in speculative value with every passing second. My phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. I tapped the speaker icon. "The Forbes piece is gaining aggressive traction," Marcus noted, his deep voice crackling over the line. "The market is reacting exactly as we modeled," I replied smoothly, setting my teacup down. "Julian is currently locked out of his own building," Marcus reported with a grim, satisfying chuckle. "I am watching the security feed right now," I told him, clicking my computer mouse. I opened a restricted administrative application. As the majority shareholder, my proxy credentials granted me unfettered access to the Seaport office security network. A grid of high-definition camera feeds populated my screen. The exterior microphones piped crisp audio directly into my office speakers. I expanded the primary lobby camera view. The sleek, glass-walled atrium was in a state of chaotic exodus. Employees streamed toward the revolving doors, clutching cardboard boxes filled with personal desk items. When a venture capital firm pulls funding without warning, corporate payroll immediately bounces. These developers and engineers were abandoning a sinking ship, desperate to salvage their own livelihoods before the bankruptcy filings permanently stained their resumes. Then, the exterior camera caught him. Julian marched up the rain-slicked pavement toward the glass entrance. He wore his tailored charcoal suit, his jaw set in a rigid, determined line. He held his phone pressed tightly to his ear, arguing frantically with someone on the other end. He still believed he could talk his way out of the crisis. He believed his sheer executive presence could bully the situation back into compliance. He stepped up to the exterior security turnstile. He slapped his digital keycard against the scanning pad with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The LED indicator flashed a harsh, unforgiving red. Julian paused. He pulled the card away, wiped the plastic against his wool lapel, and struck the pad a second time. Red. He slammed the card against the scanner a third time, his shoulders tensing. Red. "Open the door right now!" Julian screamed, his voice echoing through the exterior microphone array. Two uniformed corporate security guards stepped out from the interior lobby. They were broad-shouldered men, hired by the building management, not by Julian. They approached the glass doors from the inside, their expressions stoic and unyielding. "Your credentials are revoked, sir," the taller guard answered with bored indifference. "I own this entire floor," Julian shouted, slamming his fist against the tempered glass. "Step away from the property," the guard instructed firmly, resting a hand on his radio. Julian stepped back, his chest heaving with exertion. The guards did not flinch. The sheer humiliating reality of his situation washed over him in real time. He was not a corporate titan commanding respect. He was an unauthorized trespasser standing on a public sidewalk, throwing a temper tantrum in the rain. Employees continued to bypass him, scanning their own exit codes and stepping out into the cold morning air. None of them stopped to offer their sympathies. Several averted their eyes, embarrassed by the erratic, screaming man who had been their chief executive officer just yesterday. Julian spotted a senior software engineer carrying a heavy plastic bin. He reached out, grabbing the sleeve of the young man's jacket. "Where are you going?" Julian demanded frantically. The developer shoved Julian's hand away with a sharp, angry scowl. "My paycheck bounced, Julian." The developer spat bitterly. The young man marched down the block, leaving Julian standing alone on the wet pavement. His phone illuminated again. The ringing pierced through the ambient noise of the Boston traffic. "Are you recording this?" Marcus asked quietly over my speakerphone. "Every single second of it," I promised, leaning closer to the monitor. I watched Julian answer the call, pacing erratically near the curb. His posture wilted instantly, the frantic, arrogant energy drained from his shoulders, replaced by a heavy, slumping defeat. The investors were screaming at him. I could hear the tinny, furious voices bleeding through his phone speaker. They were demanding answers he did not possess. They were demanding the return of equity he had already squandered. By 10 o'clock, the financial ticker on my secondary screen finalized the execution. The $600 million valuation officially hit zero. The corporate entity known as NovaTech was dead. Julian slumped down onto a cold concrete planter near the street corner. He dropped his head into his hands. The tailored charcoal suit looked suddenly wrinkled and absurd, like a cheap costume worn long after the stage play had ended. He was stripped of his title, his access, and his dignity. The hollow illusion of his self-made success had been shattered by a single signature. He raised his head, staring blankly at the towering glass skyscraper. The realization finally pierced through his stubborn vanity. He had no power without the backing of the faceless venture capitalists, the expensive lunches, the corporate galas, the arrogant speeches. They were all financed by ghosts. He needed to find the proxy. He needed to find a human being to beg for mercy. He unlatched his scuffed leather briefcase, resting his slim laptop precariously on his knees. I zoomed the high-definition security camera in on his screen. The resolution was sharp enough to read his search queries. He was frantically typing into the State Business Registry database. He was digging desperately through the Delaware LLC filings for Obsidian Ventures, tracing the legal breadcrumbs left behind during the initial seed funding. He was looking for a specific name buried in the corporate paperwork. "He is searching the registry," I narrated for Marcus. "He will find Gideon's contact information," Marcus predicted grimly. "That is exactly what I want him to find," I stated with a cold smile. I watched Julian's finger freeze over the trackpad. His eyes widened. He had pulled up the original proxy acquisition charter. The document listed Gideon Hayes as the primary legal representative for the holding company. Julian remembered that name. Gideon was the same senior attorney who had processed the preliminary paperwork for our marital assets. The horrifying coincidence was slowly locking into place within his panicked mind. Julian slammed the laptop shut. He shoved the device back into his briefcase, his hands shaking in terror. He scrambled up from the concrete planter, his expensive leather boots slipping on the wet pavement. He sprinted toward the nearest intersection, wildly waving his arm to hail a yellow taxi. "He just connected the dots," I told Marcus, disconnecting the security feed. "He is heading your way," Marcus warned, the tension rising in his voice. "Let him come," I answered calmly. I ended the call. I closed the laptop, plunging my home office back into silence. The corporate siege was complete. Julian was no longer an arrogant executive planning a lavish engagement party. He was a desperate, ruined man racing across the city to confront the very woman he had just tried to discard. The trap was perfectly set, and the target was sprinting directly into the snare. The yellow taxi ride from the Seaport District to Cambridge would take approximately 25 minutes in the heavy afternoon rain. I did not spend those minutes pacing the hardwood floors or wringing my hands in anxious anticipation. I sat at my kitchen island, pouring a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea. My mobile phone rested flat against the white marble surface, the screen illuminated with a rhythmic, frantic urgency. "Missed call, Julian Vance." I watched the notification slide away, only to be instantly replaced by another. The digital counter on the lock screen steadily climbed. 54, 72, 89. He was dialing with the desperate, unbroken repetition of a drowning man thrashing for a life raft. He had connected the legal dots. Gideon Hayes was the registered agent for Obsidian Ventures. Gideon Hayes was also the quiet, imposing attorney who had drafted our marital asset protection clauses before Julian presented the settlement agreement. The geographic and legal overlap was too precise to ignore. The horrifying realization that his docile, frugal wife was the faceless billionaire who owned his entire reality had finally detonated in his mind. I listened to the electronic chime of the voicemails hitting my inbox. The first few messages were likely frantic demands for an explanation, laced with his signature executive arrogance. The subsequent messages would transition into confusion, and finally, into raw, unadulterated terror as the truth settled over him. 112 missed calls. The phone finally stopped ringing. The digital screen faded to black. A heavy, desperate thud reverberated through the Cambridge townhouse. Julian did not ring the doorbell. He slammed his fist against the heavy oak front door. The dull, rhythmic pounding echoed down the hallway, rattling the brass fixtures and vibrating through the floorboards. "Elena, open the door," he screamed from the front porch. His voice was raw and tearing at the edges, barely cutting through the howl of the autumn storm. "You have to open the door," he pleaded loudly. I set my teacup down. The porcelain clicked softly against the saucer. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my dark wool trousers. I walked slowly down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. The frantic hammering against the wood intensified. He was striking the door with the open flat of his palms, no longer caring about his manicured public image. I paused before the entryway mirror. I studied my reflection. I did not look like the terrified, accommodating woman who used to sweep up his shattered coffee mugs in a damp Somerville garage. I did not look like the quiet wife in the unbranded navy dress at the library gala. I looked cold, precise, and untouchable, the architect of his ruin. I reached out and unlocked the brass deadbolt. I pulled the heavy door inward. The bitter wind rushed into the foyer, carrying the sharp scent of wet asphalt and dead leaves. Julian stumbled across the threshold, losing his balance as the physical barrier vanished. He caught himself against the mahogany console table, his chest heaving with deep, ragged gasps. He was entirely soaked. The expensive cashmere sweater he wore clung awkwardly to his trembling frame. Rainwater dripped from his dark hair, pooling quickly on the polished hardwood floor. His designer sunglasses were missing. The arrogant, impenetrable corporate facade was entirely stripped away, exposing the hollow, terrified boy hiding underneath. Julian stared at me. His chest hitched. He read the clinical detachment in my eyes and understood instantly that the corporate execution was not a clerical misunderstanding. It was a targeted, deliberate strike. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing heavily against the wet entryway mat. "It was you the whole time," he choked out, his voice cracking. I looked down at his shivering form. It was always me. Tears spilled over his lower lids, mixing with the rain tracking down his cheeks. The chief executive officer of NovaTech was kneeling at my feet, weeping with loud, pathetic sobs. Less than 48 hours ago, he had stood in my kitchen and demanded this very house because he believed he had earned the stability. Now, he was bleeding onto the floor mat, begging for a reprieve. I did not know the truth. He begged frantically. He crawled one step forward on his hands and knees. I was blind to everything. "Elena," he sobbed into the quiet foyer. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me. "You were just foolishly arrogant. She brainwashed me from the start." He shrieked with sudden, venomous desperation. He threw Victoria under the bus without a single heartbeat of hesitation. The profound loyalty he had proudly paraded at the Boston Public Library dissolved the second his corporate credit lines froze. He was willing to sacrifice the woman he had just proposed to if it meant restoring his access to the proxy capital. Victoria manipulated the corporate ledgers, he lied, wiping his wet face with his sodden sleeve. "She isolated me from you. She poisoned my judgment. I never wanted the divorce." "You signed the settlement agreement," I reminded him coldly. I was confused by her lies. He wept loudly. He reached out his right hand, his wet fingers grasping desperately for the hem of my trousers. I stepped back. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a dramatic monologue about the $42,000 platinum ring or the dummy offshore accounts. I did not scream about his mother's insulting bribes. I looked at the man I had once loved with profound clinical disgust. He was a parasite stripped of its host. "Do not ever touch me again," I ordered smoothly. Julian froze. his hand hovering over the empty space on the floor. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with stark terror. The realization that I was immune to his tears finally took root. He was accustomed to the woman who bought him generic coffee and listened to his rants about trust fund children. He did not know how to negotiate with the silent venture capitalist who held his execution order. "Elena, please listen to me," he whimpered softly, his shoulders trembling. He leaned back on his heels, pressing his wet palms together in a pathetic gesture of prayer. "We can still fix this. I will fire her today," he promised desperately. He believed the company still existed in some recoverable form. He believed a simple termination letter could repair the devastating financial crater he had allowed his mistress to dig. He was still profoundly ignorant of the multi-million-dollar wire fraud ticking beneath his feet. He thought this was merely a lover's quarrel amplified by a frozen checking account. "You have no authority to fire anyone," I stated evenly. He stared up at me, his jaw trembling. "I am the company founder." "You are an insolvent liability," I corrected him. I reached for the heavy brass doorknob, the cold metal pressed firmly into my palm. Julian scrambled to his feet, panic flaring in his chest as he realized the conversation was ending. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, leaving a dark streak of rainwater across his cheek. He was breathing through his mouth, his chest rising and falling in erratic, panicked bursts. "What are you doing right now?" he demanded breathlessly. "Your official board meeting with Obsidian Ventures is scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning," I informed him, my tone devoid of any lingering empathy. He swallowed hard, watching my grip tighten on the door. "I highly suggest you bring legal counsel," I added quietly. "Elena, wait for a second," he gasped, reaching out toward the doorway. I stepped back and swung the heavy oak door shut. The thick wood struck the frame with a heavy, definitive thud. The deadbolt clicked sharply into place, locking him out in the cold autumn rain. I stood in the silent foyer, listening to the muffled sound of his weeping on the other side of the door. He slapped his hand against the wood once more, a weak, pathetic strike that carried no real conviction. The fight was entirely gone. His desperate crawlback had failed spectacularly. He was now forced to navigate the final hours of his crumbling reality alone. The stage was perfectly set for the ultimate betrayal, waiting in the mahogany boardroom tomorrow. The autumn storm cleared by 10 o'clock the next morning, leaving the Boston skyline sharp and washed of all haze. The climax of my marriage did not take place in a therapist's office or a quiet coffee shop. It relocated to the 42nd floor of the financial district, inside Gideon's towering glass boardroom. I arrived an hour early. I stood in the small, adjacent observation suite with Marcus, watching the main conference room through a panel of privacy glass. The boardroom was an intimidating theater of corporate power. It featured a sprawling mahogany table, 12 high-backed leather chairs, and panoramic windows overlooking the cold harbor. At 45 minutes past 9, the heavy double doors swung open. Victoria Rollins walked into the room. She wore her signature tailored white suit, the crisp fabric gleaming under the recessed lighting. She carried a sleek leather portfolio tucked confidently under her left arm. The 3-carat emerald-cut diamond rested heavy on her ring finger, catching the sunlight. She did not look like a woman whose company had just plunged into sudden insolvency. She moved with the predatory, unbothered grace of a corporate scavenger ready to pick the bones clean. Gideon sat near the head of the table, reviewing a stack of legal briefs. He did not look up when she entered. "You are 15 minutes early, Ms. Rollins," Gideon noted dryly. Victoria pulled out the leather chair directly opposite him. She sat down, crossing her legs, resting her manicured hands on the polished mahogany. She believed Gideon was the principal architect of Obsidian Ventures. She believed she was sitting across from a ruthless, faceless investor who only cared about profit margins. She assumed her own ruthlessness would serve as the perfect currency. "I prefer to be ahead of the schedule," Victoria purred smoothly. She opened her leather portfolio. She withdrew a thick, glossy dossier and slid it across the long table. The document stopped inches from Gideon's legal pad. "I know why you initiated the freeze," Victoria stated with calm, chilling confidence. Gideon adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "Do you?" "Julian Vance is an erratic, insecure liability," she declared coldly. I stood in the observation room, watching the audio waves spike on the monitor as her words fed through the hidden microphone. She was severing her ties without a single flinch. The man who had showered her with Michelin star dinners and custom jewelry was being discarded with the casual flick of her wrist. "He mismanaged the seed capital," Victoria continued smoothly. "He let his vanity dictate our quarterly burn rate. I tried to curb his reckless spending, but he refused to listen to reason." She tapped her polished fingernail against the glossy dossier. "I have drafted a proposal for a solo venture," Victoria pitched seamlessly. "I am launching a streamlined logistics firm. I already possess the client contacts and the operational blueprints. I just need a partner who can keep up." The signature line echoed through the hidden speakers. She wielded the exact phrase Julian and Beatrice had used against me. They all spoke the same toxic language, viewing loyalty as a disposable commodity. Victoria was actively attempting a hostile pivot, offering to build her new empire on the fresh grave of Julian's ruined company. Gideon did not touch the dossier. He rested his forearms against the table, his expression unreadable. "You wish for Obsidian Ventures to back your new firm," Gideon clarified flatly. Victoria offered a brilliant, predatory smile. "I am a much safer investment." Marcus stood beside me in the observation room, holding the encrypted hard drive. He shook his head, a dark, cynical laugh escaping his chest. Victoria thought she was outsmarting the entire room, entirely ignorant of the $4,200,000 ledger resting in Marcus's hands. The digital clock on the wall shifted to 10 o'clock. "It is time," I whispered. I turned away from the privacy glass. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy blazer. I did not wear the unbranded, modest crepe dress from the library gala. I wore sharp, expensive wool woven in Milan, paired with a crisp silk blouse. I looked like the apex predator she falsely believed she was. I pushed open the door of the observation suite, stepping out into the main corridor. Marcus followed closely behind me, his heavy boots silent on the plush carpet. I reached the heavy double doors of the boardroom. I grasped the polished brass handles and pushed them inward. The heavy doors swung open. I walked into the sprawling glass room. Victoria turned her head, annoyed by the sudden interruption. Her eyes landed on my face. A sharp, irritated frown creased her forehead. She recognized the navy color palette. She recognized the quiet, frugal wife she had intentionally physically blocked at the end of quarter celebration. Her posture stiffened. She glanced toward the hallway, expecting to see Julian trailing behind me with a box of tissues. "This is a closed executive meeting," Victoria snapped harshly. I continued walking across the plush carpet, my heels clicking in a slow, measured rhythm. Marcus stepped into the room behind me, pulling the heavy double doors shut. The latch clicked, sealing the three of us inside with the senior attorney. "You are in the wrong office, Elena," Victoria sneered with open contempt. She leaned back in her leather chair, crossing her arms over her pristine white suit. She assumed Julian had sent me to beg for a favorable divorce settlement. She assumed I was lost, wandering the financial district in search of mediation. "Julian is not here yet," Victoria added coldly, "and my legal counsel will handle your alimony requests later." I did not answer her. I kept my eyes fixed forward, walking a direct, unyielding path toward the head of the mahogany table. Gideon stood up from his chair. He did not address Victoria. He did not ask me to leave. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, stepped to the side, and pulled out the heavy leather chair located at the absolute center of power. He bowed his head slightly, offering a gesture of profound, professional deference. "Whenever you are ready, Madam Managing Partner," Gideon announced clearly. The words hung in the cold air of the towering glass boardroom. Victoria froze. Her arms slowly uncrossed. The smug, predatory smile vanished from her lips, replaced by a sudden, jarring stillness. She looked at Gideon, waiting for the senior attorney to correct his statement. She waited for him to explain the bizarre title. Gideon did not correct himself. He stood silently, holding the chair for me. I stepped up to the head of the table. I sat down in the heavy leather seat. I placed my hands flat against the polished mahogany, mirroring the exact posture she had used moments prior. Marcus stepped up to my right side, standing like a sentinel, resting the heavy metallic briefcase onto the table. Victoria stared at me, her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The color drained rapidly from her perfectly powdered cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray against her white collar. Her sharp, calculating eyes darted from my tailored navy blazer to Gideon's deferential posture, and finally back to my face. The horrific arithmetic was clicking into place within her mind. The modest starter wife she had mocked was sitting in the executive chair. The woman she had interrupted mid-sentence was the primary principal of Obsidian Ventures. She had just slid a hostile takeover proposal directly across the table to the very woman whose marriage she had helped destroy. "You," Victoria stammered, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. I rested my chin on my folded hands. "Good morning, Victoria." She swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She looked down at the glossy dossier she had so confidently presented to Gideon. It suddenly looked like a tragic, foolish mistake. She reached out with a trembling hand, attempting to slowly pull the document back across the wood. I placed my palm flat over the glossy cover, pinning it to the table. "Leave it," I ordered softly. Victoria snatched her hand back as if the document had burned her. Her manicured fingers shook. She sank lower into her leather chair. The razor-sharp confidence she wore upon arrival entirely shattered. She was an imposter sitting in a room built by genuine, generational power. And she had just realized she was the prey. "I did not know," Victoria whispered frantically. "You knew my husband was married." I reminded her with clinical precision. "That was Julian." She deflected desperately. She pointed a trembling finger toward the empty chairs, her self-preservation instincts overriding any semblance of dignity. She was preparing to sacrifice him again, hoping to salvage a fraction of her own survival. "He pursued me." Victoria lied smoothly. I picked up my titanium pen. "You are wearing my diamond on your left hand." Victoria looked down at her ring finger. The 3-carat emerald-cut stone seemed to suddenly weigh 1,000 pounds. She grabbed her left wrist with her right hand, instinctively trying to hide the $42,000 piece of evidence. She could not look me in the eye. The heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. Julian Vance walked into the room. He looked like a hollow, walking corpse. His designer suit was rumpled from sleeping in his office chair. His eyes were bloodshot, and dark circles bruised the delicate skin beneath his lower lashes. He carried his scuffed leather briefcase, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of his newly acquired insolvency. He stopped 10 feet inside the room, his eyes scanning the space. He saw Victoria sitting in the side chair, pale and trembling. He saw Marcus standing by the windows, holding a locked metallic briefcase. Then, his eyes traveled up the length of the long mahogany table, finally landing on the woman sitting at the head. He saw me. Julian did not scream. He did not drop to his knees as he had on my front porch the night before. He simply stared, the last fragmented pieces of his ego turning to dust in the cold, filtered sunlight. He understood that the board meeting was not a negotiation. It was a sentencing. I clicked the top of my titanium pen. The sharp mechanical snap echoed across the long room, signaling the beginning of the end. "Take a seat, Julian," I instructed coldly. The trap was officially closed. The two people who had built their arrogant, illicit reality on my quiet charity were now locked inside a glass cage, waiting for the architect to drop the floor. Julian pulled out the heavy leather chair at the far end of the table. He collapsed into the seat. His hands trembled violently as he placed them flat against the polished wood. He looked from Gideon to Victoria, and finally back to me. The silence in the glass boardroom was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of his impending execution. I did not offer a polite greeting. I extended my right hand toward Marcus. Marcus stepped forward, retrieving a thick, bound dossier from his metallic briefcase. He placed the heavy document into my palm. I tossed the dossier down the length of the mahogany table. It slid across the polished surface with a sharp, terrifying hiss, stopping precisely between Julian and Victoria. Apex Data Solutions? I began coldly, reading from a supplementary sheet. Victoria flinched, her manicured fingers curling inward. Meridian Cloud Protocols, Zenith Server Management. I continued smoothly. I looked directly at Julian. He stared at the closed cover of the dossier, his brow furrowing in deep, panicked confusion. He recognized the vendor names. He had authorized their monthly invoices just days prior. "Those are our primary infrastructure providers," Julian whispered hoarsely. "Those are offshore dummy corporations," I corrected him flatly. I leaned forward, resting my elbows against the table. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the financial autopsy with surgical precision. "Your brilliant chief operating officer did not just sleep with you, Julian," I explained, watching his eyes widen. "She forged 6 fake IT vendor contracts. She systematically siphoned $4,200,000 of my proxy capital directly into holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. She was bleeding you dry." Julian's mouth fell open. He turned his head slowly, staring at Victoria. Victoria shrank back into her leather chair. Her pristine white suit suddenly looked like a surrender flag. The predatory arrogance she had carried into the room had entirely evaporated, replaced by the frantic, trapped energy of a cornered animal. "Is it true?" Julian gasped, his voice cracking violently. Victoria did not look at him. She stared at the dossier. "Tell me you did not steal from me," Julian roared, slamming his fist onto the table. Victoria's composed facade shattered completely. She leaped to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. She pointed a trembling finger directly at his chest, her survival instincts overriding any lingering affection. "He authorized the transfers," Victoria shrieked defensively. Julian shot out of his seat. "You stole my company. You signed every single invoice," she screamed back. "I trusted you, you parasite," Julian bellowed. The ping-pong dialogue hit a fever pitch, echoing loudly against the panoramic glass windows. They were tearing each other apart. Two drowning narcissists desperately trying to use the other as a flotation device. Julian's face turned a violent shade of crimson. Victoria clutched her leather portfolio like a shield, her chest heaving with terrified, erratic gasps. I watched them implode for 5 seconds. Then, I raised a single hand. The silence fell instantly, dropping over the boardroom like a heavy wool blanket. Julian and Victoria both froze, their eyes snapping back to the head of the table. They realized simultaneously that their shouting was utterly useless. I held the keys to their survival. "There is a final detail," I announced softly. I picked up my titanium pen, tapping the metal tip against the mahogany. "You see, Julian, when you dropped that marital settlement agreement on my kitchen counter, you made a very specific legal demand." I noted calmly. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "You legally demanded that NovaTech remain your sole, separate property," I reminded him. "By signing that agreement yesterday, I legally and formally agreed to your terms." The horrific realization dawned in Gideon's eyes first. The senior attorney offered a slow, deeply impressed nod. "You accepted the corporate equity," I explained to Julian. But you also accepted 100% of the corporate liabilities prior to the insolvency declaration. I am entirely insulated. Julian staggered backward, his knees knocking against the edge of his leather chair, the ultimate twist locked into place. I had not merely signed the settlement out of quiet submission. I had signed it to legally trap him inside the burning building. He had arrogantly built his own federal cage, and I had simply locked the door. The numbers never lie, Marcus stated grimly from the corner. People do. Julian collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, agonizing wail escaped his throat. The heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. 3 individuals stepped into the room. They wore dark, unbranded windbreakers. 2 men and 1 woman. Their expressions completely devoid of emotion. Silver badges hung from heavy lanyards around their necks. They were federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, flanked by a Department of Justice liaison. Julian Vance and Victoria Rollins, the lead agent asked firmly. Victoria let out a short, terrified sob. She looked down at the 3-carat diamond on her left hand, finally understanding the true, devastating cost of the jewelry. Julian did not lift his head from his hands. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking with the violent tremors of a man who had lost absolutely everything. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I buttoned the center button of my tailored navy blazer. I walked down the length of the mahogany table, my heels clicking in a slow, victorious rhythm. I stopped directly behind Julian's chair. I looked down at the ruined, pathetic man who had demanded my absolute erasure. I just need a partner who can keep up. I whispered coldly near his ear. Julian flinched, pulling away from my voice as if it physically burned him. I turned my attention to the lead federal agent. I offered a polite, professional nod. Some investments require a total write-off, I declared smoothly to the room. I did not wait for the agents to read them their rights. I walked through the heavy double doors, leaving the 2 terrified executives to face the federal consequences of their own ravenous greed. The glass boardroom sealed shut behind me, muting the sounds of Victoria's frantic, shrieking denials. I walked into the quiet, plush reception lobby. Marcus stood near the mahogany reception desk. He held 2 steaming paper cups. He extended his right hand, offering me a dark roast coffee. Flawless execution, Marcus murmured quietly. I took the warm cup, feeling the heat radiate through the cardboard sleeve. The audit is officially complete. We walked out of the Obsidian Ventures suite together. We descended the 42 floors in the silent, pressurized elevator. We stepped out through the revolving glass doors of the skyscraper and into the crisp, biting Boston sunlight. The autumn storm had entirely passed. The sky was a brilliant, unyielding blue. I took a slow sip of my coffee, breathing in the clean, freezing air. The ultimate write-off was complete, and the ledger was perfectly balanced.